Long before European ships appeared on distant horizons, the Cherokee people inhabited the misty mountains and fertile valleys of what would become the southeastern United States. Their world stretched across an enormous territory encompassing parts of present-day North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. This was a land of endless forests, rushing rivers, and towering peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. The Cherokee called themselves Aniunwea, which translates to the principal people, or the real people. This name reflected not arrogance, but rather their understanding of themselves as human beings connected to the earth and sky, part of the great web of existence that bound all living things together. Their origin stories spoke of a time when the world was covered in water, and animals lived in a place above the sky called Galunlati. When it became too crowded there, a water beetle dove down through the waters and brought up mud from beneath, which grew and spread to become the earth. The stories continued, explaining how the great buzzard flew over this newly formed land while it was still soft and wet. Where his wings struck the ground, valleys formed, and where they turned upward, mountains rose. This was why the Cherokee homeland was so beautifully varied, with deep hollows and high ridges that created a landscape unlike any other. The animals then sent down plants and trees, and finally, people were created to live in this carefully prepared world. These origin narratives were not merely stories for entertainment. They encoded deep spiritual truths and practical wisdom about living in harmony with the natural world. The Cherokee understood that they were not separate from nature, but part of it, with responsibilities to maintain balance and reciprocity with all living things. This worldview would shape every aspect of their society, from their religious practices to their political structures, from their agricultural methods to their approach to warfare and diplomacy. The Cherokee organized their society around 7 matrilineal clans: the wolf, deer, bird, paint, blue, long hair, and wild potato clans. Clan membership passed from mother to child, creating a social structure that gave women considerable power and status. Every Cherokee belonged to their mother's clan from birth, and this membership was far more important than village or regional affiliation. The clan system functioned as a form of government, regulating marriage, determining inheritance, and administering justice. Marriage between members of the same clan was strictly forbidden, considered equivalent to incest, regardless of blood relationship. When a man and woman from different clans married, the husband moved to his wife's household or village. Children belonged to their mother's clan and were raised with her relatives playing central roles in their upbringing. The maternal uncle often served as the primary male authority figure in a child's life, more significant than the biological father in many ways. This matrilineal system meant that Cherokee women controlled property, including homes, gardens, and agricultural produce. When European observers first encountered Cherokee society, they were often shocked by the autonomy and authority that women possessed. Women served on councils, participated in decisions about war and peace, and could divorce their husbands simply by placing the man's belongings outside the home. In a world where European women had few legal rights and were considered property of their fathers or husbands, Cherokee women enjoyed freedoms that would seem revolutionary even centuries later. The Cherokee lived in permanent villages, some quite large and sophisticated. Archaeological evidence reveals settlements that existed for centuries in the same locations, with populations that could number in the hundreds or even thousands. These towns were carefully organized, typically built near rivers or streams that provided water, transportation, and fertile soil for farming. At the center of each village stood the council house, a large, circular structure that served as the heart of community life. The council house was an architectural marvel, capable of holding several hundred people for meetings, ceremonies, and social gatherings. Built of wooden posts and covered with earth or bark, These structures were designed to accommodate the entire adult population of a village for important deliberations. In the center burned a sacred fire, kept burning continuously and tended with reverence. This fire represented the life of the people, and allowing it to die was considered a terrible omen. Surrounding the council house were individual family homes. The Cherokee built their houses with remarkable skill, creating structures that were warm in winter and cool in summer. Walls were made from wooden frames covered with woven cane and clay, creating a sturdy barrier against the elements. Roofs were thatched with bark or grass. Inside, families slept on raised platforms covered with furs and woven mats. A central fire provided heat and light, with smoke escaping through an opening in the roof. Each household also maintained smaller structures, summer houses that were more open and airy, granaries for storing corn and other crops, and various storage buildings. The typical Cherokee family dwelling was far more sophisticated than early European accounts sometimes suggested. These were not primitive shelters, but carefully engineered homes designed for comfort and efficiency, refined over countless generations of experience living in the southeastern climate. Agriculture formed the foundation of Cherokee economy and culture. The Cherokee were master farmers, cultivating extensive gardens that provided the majority of their food. Corn was the most important crop, so central to life that it featured prominently in ceremonies and mythology. The Cherokee grew numerous varieties of corn, each suited to different purposes and growing conditions. They understood sophisticated agricultural techniques, including crop rotation, companion planting, and soil management. Alongside corn, the Cherokee cultivated beans and squash in the agricultural system known to anthropologists as the Three Sisters. And these three crops were planted together in a mutually beneficial arrangement that had been perfected over thousands of years. Corn stalks provided support for bean vines to climb. Beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, enriching it for the other plants. Squash leaves spread across the ground, shading the soil to retain moisture and suppress weeds. Together, these three crops provided complete nutrition and could sustain populations through the year when properly stored. The Cherokee also grew sunflowers, pumpkins, gourds, and eventually, after contact with Europeans, new crops like watermelons and sweet potatoes. Women performed most of the agricultural labor, tending the gardens with tools made from wood, bone, and stone. They developed an intricate knowledge of plant growth, weather patterns, and seasonal cycles. The agricultural calendar structured the year, with planting and harvest times marked by ceremonies and festivals that brought the entire community together. Hunting provided essential protein and materials for clothing, tools, and trade. Men were responsible for hunting, training from childhood in the skills of tracking, marksmanship with bow and arrow, and knowledge of animal behavior. Deer were the most important game, providing meat, hides for clothing, and bones for tools. The Cherokee also hunted bear, turkey, rabbits, and many other animals. Fish from the rivers supplemented the diet, caught with spears, traps, and weirs constructed across streams. Hunting was never merely a practical activity. It was surrounded by ritual and spiritual significance. Hunters performed ceremonies before the hunt, asking forgiveness from the animal spirits and promising to use every part of the kill respectfully. They understood themselves as participants in the natural cycle of life and death, not as masters over the animal world. This spiritual approach to hunting ensured that animal populations were not depleted and that the Cherokee maintained balance with the ecosystem that sustained them. Gathering wild plants provided another crucial food source and medicinal supplies. The forests of the Cherokee homeland were incredibly rich in edible and useful plants. Women and children gathered nuts, berries, roots, and greens, processing and storing them for times when other food might be scarce. The Cherokee possessed encyclopedic knowledge of the plant world, understanding which species were edible, which had medicinal properties, and which were sacred or dangerous. This deep botanical knowledge made the Cherokee expert healers. Medicine men and women used hundreds of plant species to treat illnesses and injuries. They understood how to prepare infusions, poultices, and salves. They knew which plants could reduce fever, which could stop bleeding, which could ease pain, or induce vomiting to purge poisons. This medical knowledge was guarded and passed down through apprenticeship, with healers spending years learning the properties of plants and the spiritual dimensions of healing. Cherokee governance operated on principles that balanced individual autonomy with collective decision-making. There was no single supreme leader with absolute authority. Instead, each village had its own council of elders who made decisions affecting the community. Important matters required consensus, with discussions continuing until agreement could be reached or until it became clear that no action should be taken. This emphasis on consensus rather than majority rule reflected the Cherokee value of maintaining harmony within the community. Villages were organized into regional groupings, sometimes called towns or settlements. These larger units cooperated for defense, trade, and diplomacy with other peoples. Over time, a loose confederation developed, with certain towns gaining prominence and influence. However, the Cherokee never created a highly centralized political system in the pre-contact era. Power remained diffused among multiple villages and leaders, with decisions made through negotiation and persuasion rather than coercion. Leadership roles were earned rather than inherited. A man might become a war chief by demonstrating courage and tactical skill in conflicts. A peace chief might gain influence through wisdom, eloquence, and success in maintaining relationships with other villages or peoples. Women could hold significant political power, particularly older women who had gained respect through years of experience and good judgment. The beloved woman, or gigao, was a title of honor given to exceptional women who advised councils on matters of war and peace. This fluid system of leadership meant that Cherokee society could adapt to changing circumstances. When diplomatic skills were needed, peace chiefs took prominence. When defense required military action, war chiefs led. The absence of rigid hierarchies prevented the concentration of power in few hands and ensured that leaders remained accountable to their communities. A chief who lost the confidence of the people simply lost influence, with others rising to take their place. Religion permeated every aspect of Cherokee life, not as a separate sphere, but as the foundation underlying all activities. The Cherokee believed in a spirit world that existed alongside and interpenetrated the physical world. Every mountain, river, plant, and animal had spiritual dimensions that must be acknowledged and respected. The world was full of unseen powers that could help or harm humans depending on how people conducted themselves. The concept of balance was central to Cherokee spirituality. Health, harmony, and prosperity came from maintaining proper relationships with the spirit world and with other people. Illness resulted from spiritual imbalance, from broken taboos, or from malevolent magic worked by enemies. Healing required addressing both the physical symptoms and the spiritual causes, restoring the patient to a state of balance and wholeness. Ceremonies marked the turning of seasons and the rhythms of agricultural life. The green corn ceremony, held when the first corn ripened, was among the most important annual events. This was a time of purification and renewal, when old fires were extinguished and new ones lit, when social conflicts were resolved and the community recommitted itself to living in harmony. People fasted, performed ritual dances, and gave thanks for the abundance the earth provided. The ceremony could last for several days, with prescribed rituals that had been performed for generations beyond memory. Other ceremonies honored the cycles of life and death, marked transitions from childhood to adulthood, celebrated success in hunting or warfare, or sought to influence weather and crop growth. Dancing was a crucial element of religious practice, with specific dances for different purposes. The Cherokee danced to heal the sick, to prepare for war, to celebrate victory, to mourn the dead, and to maintain connection with the spirit world. These dances were not entertainment but sacred acts that renewed the bonds between people and the greater powers that sustained life. The Cherokee lived in this carefully ordered world for centuries, perhaps millennia, before outsiders arrived. Their society was not static or primitive, but dynamic and sophisticated, capable of supporting large populations in relative prosperity. They had developed sustainable practices that allowed them to live in their homeland indefinitely, taking what they needed from the land while ensuring its continued abundance. Their social structures provided security, identity, and meaning to individuals while maintaining community cohesion. This was the world into which Europeans would intrude, bringing technologies, diseases, ideas, and ambitions that would transform everything. But before that cataclysmic encounter, the Cherokee lived as they had for countless generations, secure in their identity as the principal people, at home in the mountains and valleys that the great buzzard had formed with his wings, following the ways taught by their ancestors and preserved in story, ceremony, and daily practice. The first Europeans to encounter the Cherokee came not as friends or peaceful explorers, but as armed invaders seeking gold and glory. In the spring of 1540, the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto led an expedition northward from Florida into the interior of the continent, driven by dreams of discovering another empire as wealthy as the Aztec or Inca civilizations his countrymen had conquered. His army of roughly 600 men, along with horses, war dogs, and herds of pigs for food, cut a destructive path through territories inhabited by numerous indigenous peoples. De Soto's route took him through Cherokee country in what is now the southern Appalachian region. The exact path remains disputed among historians, but Spanish chronicles describe encounters with prosperous villages, some quite large, with abundant cornfields and sophisticated political organization. The Cherokee, like other peoples the expedition encountered, initially tried to understand these strange newcomers and their inexplicable hunger for a yellow metal that the Cherokee valued primarily for ornamental purposes. The Spanish entrada was catastrophic for the peoples it encountered. De Soto's men seized food supplies, took captives to serve as porters and guides, and demanded that villages provide women to the soldiers. When communities resisted, the Spanish unleashed terrible violence. They burned towns, executed resistors, and set their war dogs on fleeing civilians. The expedition passed through Cherokee territory relatively quickly, but it left behind something far more destructive than its direct violence: epidemic disease. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to Old World diseases. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza swept through populations that had never encountered these pathogens. A single sick person could infect an entire village, which would then spread the disease to neighboring communities through normal trade and social contacts. Mortality rates were staggering, sometimes killing half or more of a community's population within weeks. Children, elders, and even healthy adults died in numbers that seemed incomprehensible. The psychological and social impact of these epidemics equaled their demographic devastation. When sickness struck, Cherokee healers applied their traditional remedies, but plants that could heal wounds or reduce fever proved useless against smallpox or measles. The failure of traditional medicine undermined confidence in established spiritual practices and the authority of religious leaders. Communities lost not just population, but crucial knowledge holders: the elders who remembered history, the healers who knew medicinal plants, the craftspeople who possessed specialized skills. Entire villages were sometimes abandoned when disease struck, with survivors fleeing in terror or grief. The dead were so numerous that proper burial rituals could not be performed, adding spiritual trauma to physical suffering. Population decline disrupted the agricultural cycle as there were not enough people to plant, tend, and harvest crops. Hunting grounds went unused. Political structures fractured when leaders died faster than they could be replaced. The world the Cherokee had known for countless generations seemed to be ending. Despite these catastrophes, the Cherokee survived. They were resilient, adapting to the new reality of a world that now included Europeans and their diseases. Over the following decades, additional Spanish expeditions passed through or near Cherokee territory, but none established permanent settlements in the mountains. The Spanish focused their colonization efforts on the coasts and the warmer regions to the south, leaving the Cherokee homeland relatively isolated from sustained European presence for most of the 16th century. This isolation would not last. By the late 1600s, English colonists had established themselves along the Atlantic coast, creating settlements that grew steadily in population and ambition. Unlike the Spanish, who sought gold and converts, the English wanted land for farming and resources for trade. They pushed steadily westward from their coastal footholds, and by the end of the 17th century, English traders had made contact with the Cherokee. The deerskin trade transformed Cherokee society as profoundly as disease had, though more gradually and in different ways. English merchants desperately wanted deerskins, which were processed into leather for the European market. A single skin brought a good price, and hunters who could provide many hides could obtain European goods that were becoming increasingly desirable and then necessary. Metal tools, firearms, cloth, and other manufactured items offered clear advantages over traditional materials. Cherokee hunters intensified their pursuit of deer to obtain skins for trade. What had been a subsistence activity governed by spiritual protocols and practical sustainability became commercialized. Hunters killed far more deer than their communities needed for food, processing the hides for trade, and sometimes leaving the meat to rot. The spiritual relationship with animals began to erode as hunting became an economic activity driven by external market demands rather than community needs. European goods integrated into Cherokee life with remarkable speed. Metal knives, axes, and hoes were simply better than stone tools for most purposes. They were sharper, more durable, and more efficient. Within a generation, traditional tool-making skills began to decline as people relied increasingly on trade goods. Cloth was warmer and easier to produce than traditional skin clothing, and Cherokee women eagerly incorporated European textiles into their wardrobes, though often in distinctly Cherokee styles and patterns. Firearms represented the most consequential import. Guns were initially less accurate and reliable than bows, but they had psychological impact in warfare and eventually became more effective as technology improved. More importantly, gunpowder weapons could be learned relatively quickly compared to the years of training required to become proficient with a bow. Young men could become effective fighters with guns much faster than with traditional weapons. This shifted military dynamics among indigenous peoples and in conflicts with Europeans. The Cherokee became dependent on trade goods with alarming rapidity. Metal tools wore out and could not be repaired without European blacksmiths. Guns broke and needed replacement parts. Ammunition had to be purchased continuously. Cloth wore out faster than leather. Within decades, the Cherokee found themselves needing constant access to European trade goods to maintain their way of life, but they had nothing to trade except deerskins and, increasingly, the land itself. English traders were not disinterested commercial partners. Many lived among the Cherokee, learned the language, married Cherokee women, and fathered children who would play crucial roles in Cherokee history. These traders served as cultural intermediaries, explaining English customs to the Cherokee and Cherokee practices to the colonists. Some genuinely cared for their Cherokee families and communities. Others ruthlessly exploited their positions, cheating Cherokee hunters on prices, extending credit that could never be repaid, and using debt to extract land concessions. The trade also brought alcohol into Cherokee communities. Rum became a trade item that some unscrupulous merchants used deliberately to gain advantage in negotiations or to cheat intoxicated hunters. Alcohol abuse became a serious problem in some Cherokee communities, disrupting social bonds and leading to violence. Traditional Cherokee society had no experience with distilled spirits and no cultural mechanisms to moderate their use. The introduction of alcohol caused suffering that would persist for generations. As English settlements expanded, competition for Cherokee alliance intensified. The French, established in Canada and Louisiana, also sought Cherokee friendship and trade. The Cherokee found themselves courted by multiple European powers, each wanting Cherokee warriors as allies, Cherokee trade, and, ultimately, Cherokee land. The Cherokee leadership navigated these competing interests with sophisticated diplomacy, playing European powers against each other to maintain Cherokee autonomy and advantage. The early 18th century saw the Cherokee engaging in complex diplomatic relations with British colonies, particularly South Carolina and Virginia. Cherokee delegations traveled to Charleston and other colonial capitals, negotiating trade agreements, discussing boundaries, and forging alliances. These diplomatic missions were elaborate affairs, with Cherokee leaders impressing colonists with their eloquence, dignity, and political acumen. Europeans, who expected to find savages instead, encountered skilled negotiators defending their people's interests. British colonial governments recognized Cherokee sovereignty in treaties that established boundaries and trading relationships. These treaties were often violated by settlers who pushed beyond agreed boundaries, squatting on Cherokee land and provoking conflicts. Colonial governments proved unable or unwilling to restrain their own citizens, creating a pattern that would repeat endlessly. Treaties made and then broken, boundaries agreed and then ignored, Cherokee patience exhausted and violence erupting, followed by new treaties and renewed promises that would also be broken. The Cherokee engaged in warfare during this period, both among themselves in traditional conflicts and increasingly as allies or enemies of European powers. Cherokee warriors were formidable fighters, using knowledge of local terrain and guerrilla tactics that often proved devastatingly effective against European-style armies. Young men gained prestige through military success, and communities depended on warriors for defense against enemies, both indigenous and European. Warfare was changing, however. The scale of conflicts increased as European powers drew indigenous allies into their imperial struggles. The weapons became deadlier, with firearms replacing bows and tomahawks. The goals of war shifted from traditional aims like revenge or capturing prisoners to European objectives like territorial conquest and political domination. Cherokee warriors found themselves fighting in conflicts that had little to do with Cherokee interests, serving as auxiliaries in European wars that devastated indigenous communities regardless of which side they supported. The population of the Cherokee Nation, which may have numbered over 30,000 before European contact, had declined dramatically by the early 18th century. Disease continued to strike periodically, each epidemic killing thousands. In 1738, a smallpox outbreak proved particularly catastrophic, killing perhaps half the remaining Cherokee population within a single year. Entire villages were depopulated. Survivors fled to other communities, creating refugee populations that strained resources. The social fabric tore under the weight of repeated catastrophes. Despite these losses, the Cherokee maintained their identity and their homeland. They adapted continuously, incorporating European elements into Cherokee culture while retaining core values and practices. The clan system endured, women maintained their status and authority, and the Cherokee language remained the tongue of daily life. Young people still learned the stories of creation and the proper ways to conduct ceremonies. The sacred fire still burned in council houses. The Cherokee were changing, but they remained Cherokee. Trade relationships created mixed heritage families that would become increasingly important in Cherokee society. The children of European traders and Cherokee women were raised as Cherokee, belonging to their mothers' clans and considered fully Cherokee by their communities. Many of these individuals became leaders, using their bilingual abilities and bicultural knowledge to serve as intermediaries between Cherokee and European worlds. They could negotiate with colonial officials in English while maintaining credibility and authority within Cherokee society. This mixed heritage elite would eventually form a distinct element within Cherokee society, sometimes with interests and perspectives that differed from more traditional Cherokee communities. They often lived in circumstances more similar to European colonists, with frame houses, African slaves, and commercial agriculture. They were more likely to be literate in English, familiar with European legal and political systems, and comfortable in colonial society. These differences would later create tensions within the Cherokee Nation, but in the early 18th century, such individuals primarily strengthened Cherokee diplomatic capabilities. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, erupted in 1754 and drew the Cherokee into a major imperial conflict. Initially, the Cherokee allied with the British against the French and their indigenous allies. Cherokee warriors fought alongside British forces, demonstrating their military prowess in campaigns across the frontier. The alliance seemed mutually beneficial, with the Cherokee receiving trade goods, diplomatic recognition, and promises of protection against encroaching settlers. This alliance would not endure. Disputes over promised payments, abuses by British soldiers, and continued settler encroachment on Cherokee land created growing resentment. Cherokee warriors returning from campaigns found their villages threatened by the very settlers they had fought to protect. The British command structure showed contempt for Cherokee military contributions, treating Cherokee warriors as expendable auxiliaries rather than valued allies. Tensions escalated until they erupted into open warfare. The Anglo-Cherokee War began in 1758 and continued until 1761, devastating the Cherokee Nation. British forces, including regular army units and colonial militias, invaded Cherokee territory with the explicit goal of destroying Cherokee military capacity. They burned villages, destroyed crops, and killed civilians as well as warriors. The Cherokee fought back fiercely, using their knowledge of the mountains to conduct effective resistance, but they could not withstand the sustained assault of British military power backed by colonial resources. By 1761, the Cherokee faced starvation and exhaustion. Their villages were destroyed, their crops burned in the fields, their warriors killed or scattered. They had no choice but to sue for peace. The treaty that ended the war was harsh, requiring the Cherokee to cede substantial territory and accept British terms. The war had demonstrated a terrible truth. European military power could destroy Cherokee communities even in their mountain strongholds. The Cherokee could resist, could inflict casualties, could win battles, but they could not win a sustained war against enemies with greater numbers, resources, and firepower. The Cherokee emerged from the war diminished but not broken. They rebuilt their villages and replanted their fields. They mourned their dead and tended their wounds. They learned hard lessons about the realities of power in a world increasingly dominated by European empires. The old ways of warfare, the old diplomatic strategies, the old assumptions about maintaining independence through military prowess and careful alliance building, all of these would need to be reconsidered in light of what the war had revealed about Cherokee vulnerability and European ruthlessness. The period following the Anglo-Cherokee War forced the Cherokee to reconsider their position in a world that was becoming increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. The British had emerged victorious from the French and Indian War, eliminating French power in North America and establishing themselves as the dominant European force. This left the Cherokee with fewer options for playing competing powers against each other, a diplomatic strategy that had provided some protection in earlier decades. The Cherokee now faced a British Empire at the height of its power, backed by growing colonial populations that pressed constantly westward. The Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, theoretically offered some protection to Cherokee interests. This royal decree prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, designating the western lands as Indian Territory. The proclamation aimed to reduce conflicts between colonists and indigenous peoples, to allow the British government time to develop organized policies for westward expansion, and to assert royal control over colonial affairs. For the Cherokee, the proclamation seemed to promise some respite from settler encroachment. In practice, the proclamation proved nearly worthless. Colonial settlers ignored the boundary line, moving across the mountains in growing numbers to claim land they considered empty and available. These settlers were often poor families seeking economic opportunity, believing they had as much right to the land as any distant king or indigenous people. Colonial governments lacked the will or capacity to enforce the proclamation. British military forces, spread thin across a vast territory, could not patrol every valley and ridge where settlers established illegal homesteads. Cherokee leaders protested these violations repeatedly, traveling to colonial capitals to demand enforcement of treaty boundaries. They presented their grievances with eloquence and legal precision, citing specific treaty provisions and documented boundary agreements. Colonial officials offered sympathy but little action. They explained, often truthfully, that they could not control their own populations. They made promises to remove illegal settlers, promises that were rarely fulfilled. The pattern established itself firmly. Cherokee land would be taken incrementally by settlers, then the theft would be retroactively legitimized through new treaties that adjusted boundaries to accommodate the accomplished facts. The economic transformation of Cherokee society continued through this period. More Cherokee families engaged in commercial agriculture, producing surplus crops for sale rather than merely for subsistence. Some Cherokee, particularly those of mixed heritage, adopted plantation-style farming with African slaves, mirroring the economic model of Southern colonial society. This development created wealth disparities within Cherokee society that had not existed in traditional times, when resources were more evenly distributed and accumulation of wealth beyond what a family needed was neither possible nor valued. Traditional Cherokee communal land ownership began to shift toward individual property concepts under European influence. Historically, land belonged to the entire people, with families having use rights to specific fields and hunting territories, but no concept of permanent private ownership. European legal systems required individual ownership for land to be bought, sold, or inherited according to colonial law. Some Cherokee, especially those engaged in commercial agriculture, found individual ownership advantageous. This created tensions with those who maintained traditional views of land as a collective inheritance that could not be alienated. The Revolutionary War erupted in 1775, plunging the British Empire into civil war between the Crown and the rebellious colonies. The Cherokee faced a crucial decision about which side to support, or whether to remain neutral. The choice was not simple. The British represented the established authority that had at least nominally recognized Cherokee sovereignty and established boundary lines. The colonists were the settlers who had repeatedly violated Cherokee land, the source of most immediate threats to Cherokee territory and autonomy. Most Cherokee leaders initially sought neutrality, recognizing that involvement in a European civil war offered little benefit to Cherokee interests. They had learned from the French and Indian War that serving as auxiliaries in European conflicts brought devastation to Cherokee communities, regardless of which side won. Neutrality might allow the Cherokee to preserve their strength while Europeans killed each other. If the war ended quickly, the Cherokee could negotiate with whoever emerged victorious from a position of relative strength. This neutrality proved impossible to maintain. Both sides courted Cherokee alliance, offering trade goods, diplomatic recognition, and promises of land security. More importantly, both sides threatened consequences if the Cherokee supported the other side. The Cherokee faced pressure from British agents who argued that loyalty to the Crown would be rewarded, and from American revolutionaries who suggested that neutrality would be interpreted as hostility. The Cherokee were being forced to choose sides in a conflict not of their making. A significant faction of Cherokee warriors, led by a young war chief named Dragging Canoe, advocated for active resistance against the American colonists. Dragging Canoe had been present at treaty negotiations where Cherokee leaders ceded land in Kentucky and Tennessee to satisfy colonial demands and settle debts to traders. He had opposed these cessions vehemently, arguing that the Cherokee were selling their children's inheritance for temporary peace that would not last. When his elders agreed to the treaty despite his objections, Dragging Canoe reportedly warned the colonists that they had bought a dark and bloody ground. Dragging Canoe's faction, which became known as the Chickamauga Cherokee, broke away from the main Cherokee Nation in 1776. They established towns in what is now southeastern Tennessee and northwestern Georgia, positioning themselves to strike at American frontier settlements. Dragging Canoe argued that accommodation with the Americans was futile, that the colonists would never stop taking land until the Cherokee were destroyed or driven away completely. The only option was resistance, total and uncompromising, fighting to preserve what remained of the Cherokee homeland. The Chickamauga Cherokee launched a series of raids on frontier settlements throughout the Revolutionary War. They struck isolated homesteads, attacked small settlements, and ambushed travelers along wilderness roads. These attacks were devastating for frontier families, creating terror among settlers who had moved into what the Cherokee considered stolen land. American authorities responded with military expeditions against Cherokee towns, expeditions that made little distinction between hostile Chickamauga settlements and peaceful Cherokee villages. The older Cherokee leadership, including chiefs like Oconostota and Atakulakula, maintained a more cautious approach. They recognized the military power that the Americans could bring to bear and feared the destruction that all-out war would bring to Cherokee communities. They attempted to negotiate with American authorities to maintain peaceful relations with at least some colonial governments and to prevent the total devastation of the Cherokee Nation. These leaders were not collaborators or cowards, but pragmatists who remembered the Anglo-Cherokee War and understood the terrible price of military defeat. This division within Cherokee society reflected different assessments of the same reality. Dragging Canoe and his followers believed that resistance, even if ultimately unsuccessful, was preferable to slow extinction through land cession and cultural erosion. The older leadership believed that survival required accommodation, that the Cherokee could preserve their core identity and some portion of their homeland by bending rather than breaking under American pressure. Both sides were right in their analysis and tragically wrong in their hopes. American military forces repeatedly invaded Cherokee territory during the Revolutionary War. In 1776, expeditions from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia simultaneously attacked Cherokee towns, burning villages and destroying crops in coordinated campaigns designed to break Cherokee military power. Thousands of Cherokee people became refugees, fleeing into the mountains to escape advancing American armies. The destruction was systematic and thorough, with American forces showing little mercy to civilians caught in the path of their advance. The Cherokee sued for peace after these 1776 campaigns, signing treaties that ceded substantial territory. The Chickamauga Cherokee, however, continued their resistance, refusing to recognize treaties signed by chiefs they no longer acknowledged as representing their interests. This created a situation where some Cherokee were at peace with American authorities, while others remained at war, a distinction that American forces often ignored. Villages of peaceful Cherokee were attacked because of raids conducted by Chickamauga warriors, operating from different locations entirely. The pattern of the Revolutionary War years established dynamics that would persist for decades. American expansion was relentless and backed by military force. Cherokee resistance, whether armed or diplomatic, could slow but not stop this expansion. Treaties provided temporary peace but never permanent security. Each war ended with Cherokee land cessions. Each peace lasted only until settlers pushed beyond the new boundaries. provoking new conflicts that would end with new treaties and new land losses. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 ended the Revolutionary War with American victory and British withdrawal from the former colonies. The treaty made no mention of indigenous peoples or their land rights. The British, who had promised to protect indigenous allies, simply abandoned them to negotiate their own arrangements with the new American government. The Cherokee, along with other indigenous nations, found themselves dealing with a new political entity, the United States of America. The United States initially lacked clear policies toward indigenous peoples. The new nation was weak, heavily indebted from the war, and uncertain of its own survival. Different factions within American government held different views about how to deal with indigenous nations. Some believed that indigenous peoples should be treated as foreign nations, with relationships governed by treaties and diplomacy. Others viewed indigenous peoples as obstacles to American expansion who should be removed by whatever means necessary. These competing visions would create inconsistent and often contradictory federal Indian policy. The Chickamauga Cherokee continued their resistance through the 1780s and into the 1790s. Dragging Canoe led his warriors in raids that struck fear into frontier settlements across Tennessee and Kentucky. The Chickamauga allied with Creek warriors and received support from Spanish authorities in Florida, who had their own interests in checking American expansion. The Chickamauga towns became refuges for warriors from various nations who rejected accommodation with the Americans and chose continued resistance. American military expeditions repeatedly targeted the Chickamauga settlements. These campaigns were brutal, burning towns and killing anyone who could not flee quickly enough. The Chickamauga would rebuild in new locations, continuing their raids. This cycle continued year after year, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. The Chickamauga could not stop American expansion, but they could make it costly and dangerous. Americans could destroy Chickamauga towns, but could not prevent the warriors from regrouping and resuming attacks. Dragging Canoe died in 1792, reportedly from exhaustion after dancing all night at a celebration. His death removed the most charismatic and uncompromising leader of Cherokee resistance, but the Chickamauga Wars continued for several more years under other leaders. Finally, exhausted by continuous warfare and facing overwhelming American military superiority, the Chickamauga made peace in the mid-1790s. The resistance had lasted nearly 20 years, inflicting significant casualties on American forces and delaying, but not preventing, American settlement of Tennessee and Kentucky. The main body of the Cherokee Nation, meanwhile, had been pursuing a different strategy. Recognizing that military resistance alone could not preserve Cherokee sovereignty, Cherokee leaders sought to strengthen their political and economic position through adaptation. They looked for ways to prove Cherokee civilization by American standards, hoping that demonstrating their capacity for agricultural prosperity and political organization would secure American respect and recognition of Cherokee rights. This strategy of civilization and accommodation had roots in earlier Cherokee diplomacy, but it accelerated in the 1790s as Cherokee leaders grappled with the reality of American power. Influential Cherokee of mixed heritage, who understood American society intimately, argued that the path to survival lay in adopting American ways while maintaining Cherokee identity. They advocated for centralized political institutions, written laws, commercial agriculture, education, and Christianity. These changes, they believed, would make it harder for Americans to justify taking Cherokee land or denying Cherokee sovereignty. The federal government, particularly under President George Washington, encouraged this civilizing program. Federal Indian policy in the Washington administration held that indigenous peoples could and should be assimilated into American society, becoming farmers and eventually citizens. This policy was paternalistic and ultimately aimed at the disappearance of distinct indigenous cultures, but it at least recognized indigenous peoples as capable of civilization, rather than dismissing them as savages who must simply be removed or exterminated. The Cherokee embraced this program with remarkable energy and success. They established a centralized national government that began to supersede the traditional village-based political system. They created a national council that made laws applicable to all Cherokee, not just individual towns. They established courts to administer justice according to written codes rather than traditional practices. They invited missionaries to establish schools where Cherokee children could learn to read and write English. They increased commercial agriculture and livestock raising. These changes were revolutionary, transforming Cherokee society in profound ways. Traditional leadership patterns based on consensus and village autonomy gave way to more centralized authority. The role of women in governance declined as political power shifted to institutions that, following American models, excluded women from formal participation. The clan system weakened as national law superseded clan authority in matters of justice and inheritance. Christianity challenged traditional religious beliefs and practices. Not all Cherokee embraced these changes enthusiastically. Many, particularly in more remote communities, maintained traditional ways and viewed the civilization program with suspicion or hostility. They recognized that adopting American ways meant abandoning Cherokee traditions, that the price of survival might be the loss of what made them Cherokee. This created tensions within Cherokee society between progressives who advocated rapid change and traditionalists who sought to preserve old ways. These tensions would never be fully resolved, creating fault lines that would fracture the nation in years to come. Despite internal tensions and external pressures, the Cherokee entered the 19th century still in possession of substantial territory and still maintaining their identity as a distinct people. They had survived disease, warfare, and relentless pressure for land cessions. They had adapted continuously, incorporating new elements while preserving core aspects of their culture. They had produced leaders of remarkable ability who navigated the complex and dangerous world of American expansion with skill and determination. The Cherokee had endured, and they intended to continue enduring, whatever challenges the new century might bring. The early 19th century marked a period of remarkable transformation for the Cherokee Nation, a time when they consciously reshaped their society to meet what they understood as the requirements for survival in an American-dominated world. The civilization program, encouraged by federal officials and embraced by influential Cherokee leaders, accelerated dramatically after 1800. What emerged was a society that blended Cherokee and American elements in ways that were unique and, for a time, remarkably successful. The federal government's official policy toward indigenous peoples during this era was theoretically benevolent, at least as conceived by its architects. President Thomas Jefferson and his successors advocated for a gradual transformation of indigenous peoples from hunters to farmers, from communal societies to individual property holders, from oral traditions to literate cultures. Federal agents distributed plows, spinning wheels, and other agricultural implements. Government-funded schools taught English literacy and useful trades. Missionaries received federal support to establish stations among the Cherokee where they could preach Christianity and model American domestic life. The Cherokee response to this civilization program was neither passive acceptance nor unified resistance, but rather a complex negotiation of what to adopt, what to adapt, and what to preserve. Cherokee leaders recognized that demonstrating their capacity for civilization, as Americans understood the term, might provide some protection against removal pressures. If the Cherokee could prove themselves as civilized as their American neighbors, then the justifications for taking their land would become harder to sustain. This was a calculated strategy, not cultural surrender, though the long-term costs of the strategy would prove higher than its architects anticipated. Agriculture underwent dramatic changes in the early 19th century. While the Cherokee had always been farmers, they now shifted toward American-style commercial agriculture. Individuals, particularly those of mixed heritage and wealth, established large plantations with extensive fields of cotton, corn, and other cash crops. These plantations were worked by African slaves whose numbers in the Cherokee Nation grew substantially during this period. By the 1820s, the Cherokee Nation included over 1,000 enslaved people, owned primarily by a relatively small number of wealthy Cherokee families. The adoption of slavery represented one of the most troubling aspects of Cherokee civilization efforts. It was justified by some Cherokee leaders as proof of their adoption of American economic practices, a demonstration that Cherokee planters were indistinguishable from American planters. Slavery provided labor for the commercial agriculture that federal officials encouraged. It also created a class of wealthy Cherokee who had economic interests aligned with Southern planters and who could negotiate with American authorities from a position of demonstrated prosperity. Traditional Cherokee society had practiced a form of slavery quite different from the chattel slavery of the American South. Captives taken in war might be adopted into clans or kept as servants, but they were not property to be bought and sold, and their children were not born into perpetual bondage. American-style slavery, with its racial basis and hereditary bondage, was a foreign import. Many traditional Cherokee opposed it, viewing it as incompatible with Cherokee values, but the institution took root among the progressive elite who shaped national policy. The Cherokee developed sophisticated economic institutions during this period. They established ferries, turnpikes, and toll roads. They built grist mills, sawmills, and blacksmith shops. They operated stores and trading posts. Some Cherokee became merchants, accumulating wealth through commercial enterprises. This economic development created a prosperous middle class alongside the planter elite, both groups with strong interests in maintaining the Cherokee Nation as a stable, recognized entity. Political centralization accelerated as the Cherokee constructed a more unified national government. In 1808, they established a national police force, the Light Horse Guard, to enforce laws and maintain order. This marked a significant shift from traditional justice systems based on clan responsibility and blood revenge. The Light Horse Guard operated under the authority of the National Council rather than individual clans or towns, representing the concentration of power in centralized institutions. The Cherokee created a written law code in 1808 establishing uniform laws that applied throughout the nation. These laws addressed property rights, criminal offenses, marriage, and inheritance. They represented a dramatic departure from traditional practices, imposing American legal concepts onto Cherokee society. The law code was necessary, its advocates argued, to demonstrate Cherokee civilization to American observers and to create the institutional structures necessary to govern an increasingly complex society. In 1820, the Cherokee Nation was divided into 8 districts for administrative purposes, each with representatives to the National Council. This structure resembled American state governments, with geographic representation replacing the traditional town-based system. The change diluted the power of traditional town councils and village chiefs, concentrating authority in the national government. It also weakened the role of women who had participated in town councils but were excluded from the new national institutions that followed American gender norms. Religious transformation accompanied political and economic changes. Christian missionaries established numerous stations throughout the Cherokee Nation, building churches, schools, and model farms. Moravians, Presbyterians, Baptists, and Methodists competed for Cherokee converts. Some Cherokee embraced Christianity enthusiastically, seeing it as the religion of the powerful Americans and believing that conversion demonstrated their civilization. Others combined Christian and traditional beliefs in syncretic practices. Many, particularly in remote areas, maintained traditional religious practices unchanged. The missionaries provided education along with evangelization. Mission schools taught Cherokee children to read and write English, to perform arithmetic, and to master various practical skills. Some schools offered advanced education, preparing Cherokee youth for leadership roles in the changing nation. These schools produced a generation of literate Cherokee who could engage with American legal and political systems, read newspapers and government documents, and serve as diplomats and negotiators. Education was not limited to mission schools. Wealthy Cherokee families sent their children to academies in the eastern states, where they received education identical to that of elite American youth. These Cherokee students returned home fluent in English, familiar with American culture, and equipped with skills valuable for navigating the complex relationship between the Cherokee Nation and the United States. They formed a bilingual, bicultural elite that would lead the nation through its most challenging years. Cherokee women's roles shifted significantly during this period, generally in ways that reduced their traditional authority and autonomy. American gender norms promoted by missionaries and federal agents emphasized male authority and female domesticity. Cherokee men increasingly controlled property, made political decisions, and represented families in public affairs. Women were pushed toward domestic roles, expected to focus on household management and child-rearing rather than agriculture and politics. This represented a dramatic change from traditional Cherokee society where women had controlled agricultural production, owned homes and fields, participated in councils, and exercised significant political influence. The beloved woman, Gigaw, who had advised on matters of war and peace, had no equivalent in the new political structures. Cherokee women lost ground as the nation adopted American practices, though they did not become as subordinate as American women, retaining property rights and some degree of autonomy that American law denied to women. The most significant development of this era was the creation of a written Cherokee language by Sequoyah, a Cherokee silversmith and warrior who became one of the most remarkable figures in Cherokee history. Sequoyah had no formal education and did not speak or read English. He was a traditional Cherokee in many respects, living a relatively simple life and maintaining traditional practices. Yet, he possessed extraordinary intellectual gifts and the determination to achieve what seemed impossible. Sequoyah began working on a written form of Cherokee around 1809, motivated by his observation of how writing gave Americans power. He saw that written documents could communicate across distances, preserve information over time, and establish agreements that could not be disputed later. He believed that if the Cherokee had their own writing system, they could maintain their language and culture while gaining the advantages that literacy provided. His initial approach involved creating a symbol for every word in the Cherokee language, but he soon realized this would require thousands of characters and prove impractical to learn or use. He then conceived a brilliant innovation, a syllabary rather than an alphabet. Instead of symbols representing individual sounds that must be combined into syllables and words, his system used symbols representing complete syllables. The Cherokee language has relatively few syllable sounds, making a syllabary manageable in size. Sequoyah worked for 12 years, testing and refining his system. His family and neighbors thought he was wasting his time or possibly going mad, spending hours making marks on bark and paper instead of working productively. He persevered through ridicule and hardship, driven by his vision of what Cherokee literacy could accomplish. By 1821, he had perfected a syllabary of 86 characters that could represent every sound in the Cherokee language. Sequoyah first taught the system to his daughter, demonstrating that it could be learned and used. He then presented it to Cherokee leaders, who were initially skeptical. The test they devised was simple and dramatic. Sequoyah and his daughter were separated, and Sequoyah was told a message. His daughter, in another location, wrote down what he said using the syllabary. When her writing was brought back and read by Sequoyah, reproducing the exact message, the chiefs were convinced. This was not magic or trickery, but a genuine system of writing. The syllabary spread through the Cherokee Nation with astonishing speed. Its elegance and simplicity meant that a Cherokee speaker could learn to read and write in their own language within days or weeks. Cherokee people who had never learned English, who were too old or too busy to attend schools, could suddenly achieve literacy in their own language. Within months, thousands of Cherokee could read and write. Within a few years, the Cherokee Nation had higher literacy rates than many American states. The syllabary preserved the Cherokee language at a crucial moment when English was threatening to displace it, particularly among the educated elite. It allowed Cherokee people to write letters, keep records, and communicate across the nation in their own language. It gave Cherokee culture a permanence that oral tradition alone could not provide. It demonstrated Cherokee intellectual capacity in a way that could not be dismissed by those who doubted Indigenous peoples' ability to achieve civilization. In 1827, the Cherokee Nation adopted a written constitution, modeled closely on the United States Constitution, but explicitly asserting Cherokee sovereignty. The Constitution established a three-branch government with a principal chief, a national council, and a court system. It defined citizenship, property rights, and the powers and limits of government. It declared that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign and independent nation, that Cherokee land was held communally by the nation, and that no land could be sold without the consent of the National Council. The Constitution represented the culmination of decades of political evolution. It formalized the centralized government that had been developing since the early 1800s. It created clear structures of authority and processes for making law. It was a sophisticated document that demonstrated Cherokee capacity for self-governance according to modern standards. Its adoption marked the transformation of the Cherokee from a loose confederation of towns into a constitutional republic. John Ross emerged during this period as the principal chief who would lead the Cherokee Nation through its greatest crisis. Ross was 7/8 Scottish by ancestry, but culturally Cherokee, having been raised in the Cherokee Nation and identifying completely with his people. He was fluent in English and Cherokee, educated and successful in business, and possessed political skills that made him an effective leader. He was also absolutely committed to maintaining Cherokee sovereignty in the Cherokee homeland. The Cherokee Nation that Ross led was prosperous and progressive by any measure. It had a functioning government, a legal system, schools, churches, newspapers, and a thriving economy. The Cherokee had met and exceeded every demand that advocates of civilization had made. They had transformed their society, adopting American practices while maintaining their distinct identity. They had done everything that federal officials had said would secure their future. They believed, with considerable justification, that they had earned the right to remain in their homeland as a sovereign people. This belief would be tested as never before. Despite everything the Cherokee had accomplished, despite their remarkable success at civilization, voices calling for their removal were growing louder. The state of Georgia, which claimed Cherokee land within its borders, was becoming increasingly aggressive in asserting authority over Cherokee territory. Settlers hungry for Cherokee land cared nothing about Cherokee civilization or sovereignty. They wanted the land and they had the votes to elect politicians who would give it to them. The Cherokee faced a cruel paradox. They had civilized themselves as Americans demanded, and in doing so they had made themselves more threatening to American interests. A literate, politically sophisticated, economically prosperous Cherokee Nation was harder to dismiss as savage obstacles to progress. But it was also a permanent competitor for valuable land, a sovereign government within states that tolerated no other governments, and a rebuke to those who believed that indigenous peoples were incapable of civilization and thus deserving of dispossession. The Cherokee had transformed themselves over a single generation from a traditional society into a modern nation-state. They had preserved their language, their identity, and their sense of themselves as a people while adopting new forms and institutions. They had created something unique, a Cherokee Republic that was thoroughly Cherokee and thoroughly modern. They had done everything possible to secure their future in their ancestral homeland. It would not be enough. The Cherokee Phoenix began publication in February 1828, making history as the first newspaper published by an indigenous nation and the first bilingual newspaper in North America. Printed in both English and Cherokee using Sequoyah's syllabary, the Phoenix gave the Cherokee Nation a powerful voice in the national conversation about Indian policy and removal. Its editor, Elias Boudinot, was a young Cherokee intellectual who had been educated at the Foreign Mission School in Connecticut and had traveled throughout the eastern states giving speeches about Cherokee progress and civilization. The Phoenix was more than a newspaper. It was a declaration of Cherokee modernity and a tool of resistance. Each issue demonstrated Cherokee literacy, political sophistication, and commitment to their homeland. The paper published Cherokee laws, council proceedings, and news from Cherokee districts. It printed articles about agricultural improvements, educational progress, and moral advancement. It also published vigorous defenses of Cherokee sovereignty and detailed refutations of arguments for removal. Every issue proclaimed that the Cherokee were a civilized people deserving of respect and the right to remain in their homeland. The Phoenix reached readers far beyond the Cherokee Nation. Subscribers in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and other northern cities read accounts of Cherokee life that contradicted prevailing stereotypes about indigenous peoples. Missionary societies, religious newspapers, and humanitarian organizations used the Phoenix as evidence that civilization programs could succeed, that indigenous peoples could progress if given the opportunity. The paper made the Cherokee cause visible to Americans who might never visit Cherokee country but could now read Cherokee words and recognize Cherokee humanity. This visibility came at a crucial moment. The election of Andrew Jackson as president in 1828 marked a fundamental shift in federal Indian policy. Jackson had built his military reputation fighting indigenous peoples, including leading campaigns that killed thousands of Creek and Seminole people. As president, he made clear his belief that indigenous peoples could not survive as independent nations within state boundaries and must be removed west of the Mississippi River. Jackson's election signaled that the era of federal support for civilization programs was ending, replaced by an explicit policy of removal. Georgia had been pressing claims to Cherokee land for years, arguing that an 1802 compact with the federal government required the United States to extinguish Indian title to lands within Georgia's borders. The state grew increasingly impatient with federal inaction and with the Cherokee refusal to negotiate removal. In 1828, the Georgia legislature began passing laws that extended state authority over Cherokee territory, nullifying Cherokee laws and asserting that Cherokee people had no rights that Georgia was bound to respect. These Georgia laws were deliberately designed to make life impossible for the Cherokee. They prohibited Cherokee courts from meeting, banned the Cherokee government from functioning, declared Cherokee laws null and void, and forbade Cherokee people from testifying against white people in court. The laws made it legal for white people to trespass on Cherokee land, to steal Cherokee property, and to assault Cherokee individuals with no legal recourse available to victims. Georgia was attempting to destroy the Cherokee Nation through legal harassment and official lawlessness. The discovery of gold on Cherokee land in northern Georgia in 1829 intensified the crisis. Thousands of prospectors rushed onto Cherokee territory, illegally occupying Cherokee land and establishing mining camps. The Georgia Guard, a state militia created specifically to enforce Georgia's laws in Cherokee territory, made no effort to remove these trespassers. Instead, they harassed Cherokee people and protected white miners who were stealing Cherokee gold and land. The gold rush created chaos and violence, with Cherokee families driven from their homes by armed intruders backed by state authority. The Cherokee responded to Georgia's aggression not with violence, but with legal resistance. They hired lawyers, including William Wirt, who had served as United States Attorney General, to challenge Georgia's laws in federal court. The Cherokee argued that they were a sovereign nation, that treaties between the Cherokee Nation and the United States were supreme law that states could not violate, and that Georgia's laws were unconstitutional. This strategy sought to use American law against American aggression, forcing the federal government to honor its treaty obligations. The case known as Cherokee Nation versus Georgia reached the Supreme Court in 1831. The Cherokee asked the court to block Georgia's laws as unconstitutional violations of Cherokee sovereignty and treaty rights. Chief Justice John Marshall, writing for the court, declined to rule on the merits. He held that the Cherokee Nation was not a foreign nation in the constitutional sense and thus could not bring suit directly in the Supreme Court. However, Marshall's opinion included language that would prove important, describing indigenous nations as domestic, dependent nations with a relationship to the federal government, resembling that of a ward to his guardian. This decision was a setback, but not a total defeat. Marshall had recognized that indigenous nations possessed some form of sovereignty, even if not the full sovereignty of foreign nations. The legal battle continued in another form. Samuel Worcester and Eleazar Butler, two missionaries working in the Cherokee Nation, refused to comply with a Georgia law requiring white people residing in Cherokee territory to obtain state licenses and swear oaths of loyalty to Georgia. They argued that Georgia had no authority in Cherokee territory and that their presence was authorized by federal law, not subject to state control. Georgia arrested Worcester and Butler, convicted them in state court, and sentenced them to 4 years of hard labor in the state penitentiary. The missionaries appealed their convictions to the Supreme Court, setting up another test of Cherokee sovereignty and Georgia's authority. This case, Worcester versus Georgia, reached the Supreme Court in 1832. The legal arguments were similar to those in the earlier case, but this time the court had clear jurisdiction because the case came through normal appeals from state court involving non-Cherokee parties. Chief Justice Marshall delivered the court's opinion in March 1832, and it was a sweeping victory for the Cherokee cause. Marshall held that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community with territorial boundaries within which Georgia law had no force. He ruled that the Constitution gave the federal government exclusive authority over relations with indigenous nations, that treaties between the United States and the Cherokee were supreme law, and that Georgia's laws extending state authority over Cherokee territory were unconstitutional and void. The conviction of Worcester and Butler was overturned, and they were ordered released. The Cherokee celebrated the decision as vindication of everything they had argued. They had taken their case to the highest court in the land, and that court had ruled in their favor. The legal system that they had trusted, the Constitution that they had appealed to, the rule of law that they had relied upon, all had affirmed Cherokee sovereignty and Cherokee rights. Cherokee leaders believed that Georgia would now be forced to back down, that President Jackson would enforce the court's decision, and that the Cherokee future in their homeland was secure. This hope was shattered almost immediately. Georgia refused to comply with the Supreme Court decision. Governor Wilson Lumpkin declared that Georgia would not yield to federal judicial tyranny. The state continued enforcing its laws in Cherokee territory. The Georgia Guard continued harassing Cherokee people, and Worcester and Butler remained in prison. Georgia gambled that President Jackson would not enforce the Supreme Court ruling, and that gamble proved correct. Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether Jackson spoke those exact words is disputed, but his actions made his position clear. He took no steps to enforce the Supreme Court decision. He did not send federal troops to Georgia. He did not order Georgia to comply with the ruling. He allowed Georgia to defy the Supreme Court with impunity, demonstrating that the legal victory the Cherokee had won was meaningless without executive branch enforcement. This moment revealed a fundamental truth about law and power. The Cherokee had been told that American law would protect them, that treaties were sacred, that the Constitution guaranteed their rights. They had believed these assurances and built their resistance strategy around legal appeals to American principles. Now they learned that law meant nothing when the government chose not to enforce it, that constitutional rights could be violated without consequence if the victims lacked the power to compel respect. The failure of the Worcester decision broke something in Cherokee confidence. Principal Chief John Ross continued to insist that legal and diplomatic resistance would ultimately prevail, that the American people would demand justice once they understood the Cherokee situation fully. But other Cherokee leaders began to question whether Ross's strategy could succeed. If the Supreme Court could rule in Cherokee favor and the president could simply ignore the ruling, what hope remained for legal resistance? A faction within the Cherokee leadership began advocating for negotiating a removal treaty. These men, led by Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, were not collaborators or traitors in their own understanding. They were patriots who believed that removal was now inevitable and that negotiating the best possible terms was the only way to preserve the Cherokee people. They looked at the reality of Georgia's aggression, federal abandonment, and American public opinion, and concluded that the Cherokee could not win this fight. Major Ridge was an old warrior who had fought alongside Andrew Jackson against the Creek, a wealthy planter who owned slaves and operated successful businesses, and a respected leader whose opinion carried weight. He argued that if the Cherokee waited until they were forced out at bayonet point, they would get nothing in compensation and would arrive in the West destitute. If they negotiated while they still had some leverage, they might secure good land, fair payment for their improvements, and assistance with removal costs. Resistance was honorable but futile. Pragmatic negotiation offered the only path to Cherokee survival. John Ridge, the major's son, had been educated in Connecticut and had married a white woman from a prominent family. He was articulate, intelligent, and deeply committed to Cherokee welfare. He traveled to Washington to negotiate with the Jackson administration, seeking terms that might make removal acceptable. He argued that the Cherokee could build a new nation in the West, free from state interference, able to govern themselves without American settlers encroaching constantly. Removal meant losing the homeland, but it might preserve Cherokee sovereignty and cultural survival. Elias Boudinot, as editor of the Phoenix, initially defended Cherokee sovereignty and opposed removal vigorously. But he came to believe that continued resistance was leading the Cherokee toward catastrophe. Georgia's harassment was destroying Cherokee society from within. Cherokee people were being impoverished by inability to enforce contracts. Driven from their homes by trespassers they could not legally resist, and demoralized by the daily indignities of living under Georgia's oppressive laws. Boudinot believed that removal, however painful, was preferable to the slow destruction that Georgia was inflicting. John Ross and the majority of Cherokee people rejected this reasoning absolutely. Ross argued that negotiating removal would make it inevitable, that if Cherokee leaders agreed to leave, the moral argument against forced removal would collapse. He insisted that the Cherokee had legal and moral right to their homeland, that continuing resistance would eventually succeed, and that abandoning the fight would betray future generations. Ross had mass support. When the Cherokee people were asked their opinion, overwhelming majorities opposed removal in any form. This division within Cherokee leadership created two factions that became known as the National Party, led by Ross and supporting continued resistance, and the Treaty Party, led by the Ridges and Boudinot and supporting negotiated removal. The division was not between traditionalists and progressives or between full-blood and mixed-blood Cherokee. Leaders on both sides were educated, prosperous, and committed to Cherokee welfare. They simply disagreed about whether resistance or accommodation offered the best chance for Cherokee survival. The Treaty Party proceeded without authorization from the Cherokee national government or the Cherokee people. In December 1835, at the home of Elias Boudinot in New Echota, a small group of Cherokee men met with federal commissioners to negotiate a removal treaty. Fewer than 100 Cherokee attended this meeting, out of a population of over 15,000. John Ross and the vast majority of Cherokee people boycotted the meeting, refusing to participate in what they considered an illegitimate proceeding. The treaty negotiated at New Echota provided that the Cherokee would cede all their land east of the Mississippi River in exchange for land in Indian Territory, a payment of $5 million, assistance with removal costs, and transportation west. The treaty gave the Cherokee 2 years to remove voluntarily before they would be forcibly removed by the army. Major Ridge, John Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and a handful of others signed the treaty. None of them represented the Cherokee national government. The overwhelming majority of Cherokee people opposed the treaty and considered it fraudulent. John Ross immediately began fighting the treaty's ratification. He organized a petition drive that gathered nearly 16,000 Cherokee signatures opposing the treaty. This represented almost the entire Cherokee population, demonstrating that the Treaty of New Echota had no legitimate support. Ross traveled to Washington bringing the petitions and pleading with senators to reject the treaty. He argued that it violated Cherokee law, which made unauthorized land cessions punishable by death, and that it contradicted basic democratic principles by imposing the will of a tiny minority on a vast majority. The Senate debated the treaty in the spring of 1836. Opponents argued that it was fraudulent, negotiated with people who had no authority, and rejected by the Cherokee people themselves. They noted that even supporters of removal should oppose this treaty because it established a terrible precedent, that the United States would accept treaties negotiated by unauthorized individuals against the will of the people they supposedly represented. The debate was intense, with the outcome uncertain until the final vote. The Treaty of New Echota was ratified by the Senate on May 23, 1836, by a margin of 1 vote. It became the legal basis for Cherokee removal, despite being opposed by nearly the entire Cherokee Nation. The ratification demonstrated that American democracy, when it came to indigenous peoples, was a sham. The will of the Cherokee people counted for nothing. Their legal rights meant nothing. Their decades of civilization efforts meant nothing. What mattered was that American citizens wanted Cherokee land, and American politicians would give it to them regardless of law, justice, or morality. Major Ridge, understanding what he had done, reportedly said after signing the treaty, "I have signed my death warrant." He knew that Cherokee law prescribed death for those who sold Cherokee land without authorization. He believed that his sacrifice was necessary to save the Cherokee people from something worse than removal. He was wrong about many things, but he was right about his own fate. The treaty he signed would lead to the Trail of Tears, the destruction it was supposed to prevent. And it would also lead to his death and the deaths of others who had signed it, killed by Cherokee who viewed them as traitors who had sold the nation. The 2 years following the ratification of the Treaty of New Echota were filled with desperate Cherokee resistance and increasingly aggressive federal pressure. John Ross refused to accept the treaty as legitimate and continued fighting it through every legal and political channel available. He organized delegations to Washington, met with sympathetic congressmen, appealed to religious and humanitarian organizations, and worked to build public opposition to forced removal. The Cherokee people, following Ross's lead, simply refused to prepare for departure, believing until the last possible moment that justice would prevail and they would be allowed to remain in their homeland. The federal government, having obtained its treaty through fraud, proceeded as though it were legitimate. Federal agents arrived in Cherokee territory to begin enrollment for removal, setting up offices where Cherokee families were supposed to register for emigration. The vast majority of Cherokee people refused to register, stayed away from enrollment centers, and ignored federal communications about removal. They went about their lives as normally as possible, planting crops, tending livestock, operating businesses, and maintaining their communities as though the threat of removal might somehow disappear if they refused to acknowledge it. A small number of Cherokee did remove voluntarily during this period. Some were Treaty Party members and their families who recognized that they would face Cherokee justice for their role in the fraudulent treaty and who sought safety in the West. Others were individuals who concluded that removal was inevitable and preferred to go while they could still choose their route, timing, and traveling companions. These voluntary emigrants numbered perhaps 2,000 out of a total Cherokee population of 16 to 17,000. The rest remained, waiting and hoping. President Martin Van Buren, who succeeded Andrew Jackson in March 1837, showed no inclination to reverse or reconsider removal policy. Van Buren had been Jackson's vice president and political heir, committed to completing what his predecessor had started. The treaty deadline of May 1838 approached with the overwhelming majority of Cherokee people still in their homeland, still refusing to accept that they would be forced out. The federal government began assembling the military force necessary to implement removal by coercion, since voluntary emigration had clearly failed. General Winfield Scott received command of the removal operation. Scott was a professional soldier, a veteran of the War of 1812, and a man who understood that he was being ordered to carry out a mission that many Americans, including many of his own soldiers, found morally repugnant. He issued a proclamation to the Cherokee people in May 1838, announcing that the time for voluntary removal had expired and that military force would now be employed to effect their departure. Scott's proclamation was paternalistic, urging Cherokee people not to resist and promising that soldiers would treat them humanely. The roundup began in late May 1838. Federal troops and militia units from surrounding states moved through Cherokee territory, going from home to home and farm to farm, forcing Cherokee people at bayonet point to abandon everything and assemble at collection points. Families were given no time to gather belongings, to secure their property, or to make arrangements for what they were leaving behind. Soldiers appeared at the door, ordered everyone out immediately, and marched them away. People left meals cooking on the fire, crops growing in fields, and possessions of a lifetime sitting in homes that they would never see again. The process was brutal and chaotic. Soldiers showed little concern for Cherokee dignity or welfare. Families were separated, with individuals scattered to different collection points. Elderly people and small children were forced to march miles to stockades where they would await departure. Sick and disabled individuals received no special consideration. The soldiers were carrying out orders, and most showed neither cruelty nor compassion, but simply mechanical efficiency in executing a difficult and unpleasant task. As Cherokee people were marched to collection points, white Georgians descended on their abandoned homes like vultures on carrion. They looted houses, stole livestock, burned buildings, and claimed Cherokee property for themselves. Land that Cherokee families had cultivated for generations was seized by settlers who had no legal claim, but who knew that no one would stop them. Years of Cherokee labor, investment, and improvement were stolen in a matter of days, with the theft sanctioned by state authorities who had waited eagerly for this opportunity. The collection camps where Cherokee people were confined while awaiting removal were scenes of misery and suffering. Thousands of people were crowded into stockades with inadequate food, water, and shelter. Sanitation was minimal or non-existent. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, measles, and whooping cough killed dozens even before the journey west began. Families huddled together, traumatized by their forced removal from home and terrified of what lay ahead. The initial removal parties departed in June 1838 at the height of summer heat. The plan was to move the Cherokee west along several routes, some by water via the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers, others overland through Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and Arkansas to Indian Territory. The summer journey proved disastrous. Temperatures soared, water sources dried up or became contaminated, and disease struck with devastating effect. People died by the dozens every day, their bodies buried in shallow graves along the trail, or simply left behind as the parties pressed forward. Seeing the catastrophic death rates from summer removal, John Ross negotiated with General Scott to suspend removal operations until fall. Scott agreed, recognizing that continuing summer removals amounted to mass killing. Ross also secured permission for the Cherokee to organize and conduct their own removal, rather than having it directed entirely by military authorities. This concession gave Ross some control over the process and allowed Cherokee people to travel with family members and community groups rather than being randomly assembled by soldiers. The Cherokee used the summer months to organize 13 removal detachments, each containing roughly 1,000 people, and led by Cherokee conductors who would make decisions about daily travel, camping sites, and other logistics. These groups assembled in the fall of 1838, preparing for the journey they had fought so hard to avoid. Cherokee families sold what property they could, said goodbye to their homeland, and steeled themselves for the journey that stretched before them, over 800 miles across mountains, rivers, and prairies to an unknown land. The main body of Cherokee people began their westward journey in October 1838, traveling overland along routes that passed through Tennessee, Kentucky, southern Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas before reaching Indian Territory. Each detachment followed a slightly different route based on road conditions, availability of supplies, and the judgment of conductors. All faced similar challenges: difficult terrain, harsh weather, inadequate provisions, and the accumulated trauma of forced removal, compounded by daily hardship. The journey unfolded as a grinding ordeal that lasted through fall and into the brutal winter months. Cherokee people walked or rode in wagons through rain that turned roads into impassable mud. They forded rivers swollen by autumn storms, with the sick and elderly sometimes drowning during crossings. As November and December arrived, bitter cold added to their suffering. Snow and ice made travel treacherous and exposed people already weakened by poor food and disease to conditions that killed the vulnerable by the hundreds. The death toll mounted with horrifying steadiness. Every day brought new graves. Children died from measles and whooping cough. Elderly people succumbed to exhaustion and exposure. Adults weakened by dysentery simply could not continue and died by the roadside. Women gave birth during the journey, sometimes to infants who survived only hours or days. The Cherokee buried their dead in hasty graves when time and frozen ground allowed, or simply left bodies behind when they could not. The trail west became marked by Cherokee graves stretching across half the continent. Accounts from the removal vary in specific details but agree on the essential horror of the experience. One missionary who accompanied a detachment wrote that he saw Cherokee people dying every day, that the road was littered with the dead and those too weak to continue. A white observer in Kentucky described seeing Cherokee removal parties passing through his area, noting the profound grief visible on their faces and the constant sound of coughing from sick children and adults. The removal parties moved slowly, sometimes covering only a few miles per day when weather was bad or sickness had struck heavily. The routes passed through settlements where some Americans showed kindness, providing food, shelter, or medical care to suffering Cherokee people. More often, the Cherokee encountered indifference or exploitation, with merchants charging inflated prices for supplies and communities refusing to allow Cherokee people to camp near their towns. Some Americans jeered at the passing Cherokee, mocking their misery and celebrating their expulsion. Others watched silently, perhaps feeling shame, but doing nothing to protest the injustice unfolding before them. The water routes proved no better than the overland trails. Cherokee people packed onto steamboats and flatboats for the river journey suffered from crowding, inadequate food, and disease just as those who walked did. River travel added the danger of accidents, with boats sinking or running aground, sometimes drowning passengers. The river routes also required an overland portion from the point where boats could no longer navigate to the final destination in Indian Territory, meaning that water route emigrants still faced significant overland travel under harsh conditions. The removal parties began arriving in Indian Territory in January 1839, with the last detachments reaching their destination in March. They arrived broken, traumatized, and significantly reduced in number. Of the approximately 16,000 Cherokee people who were forced to leave their homeland, at least 4,000 died during the removal process or in the months immediately following. Some estimates place the death toll higher, perhaps approaching 5,000. These were not combat casualties, but the victims of government policy implemented through bureaucratic procedures and military force. The dead included some of the most prominent Cherokee people. Quatie Ross, the wife of Principal Chief John Ross, died during the journey after giving her blanket to a sick child. She was buried in Arkansas, one of thousands who never reached the new Cherokee lands. Many others who survived the journey died in the difficult first months in Indian Territory, as disease continued ravaging a population weakened by trauma and privation. The removal killed not just individuals, but families, communities, and countless connections that had bound Cherokee society together. The journey became known as the Trail of Tears, a name that captures the profound grief and suffering but cannot fully convey the magnitude of the tragedy. It was not a single trail, but multiple routes. It was not a brief march, but months of suffering stretching from summer into spring. It was not merely a physical journey, but a spiritual and cultural trauma that would mark the Cherokee people for generations. The Trail of Tears represented the complete failure of every strategy the Cherokee had employed to preserve their homeland. Military resistance had failed, legal challenges had failed, diplomatic negotiation had failed, and civilization efforts had failed. The removal proved what Cherokee resistors had argued all along. American promises were worthless, treaties meant nothing, and justice would not prevail when it conflicted with American expansionist ambitions. The Cherokee had done everything that federal authorities had asked. They had civilized themselves, established a constitutional government, created a literate society, adopted Christianity, and demonstrated their capacity for progress by every American standard. None of it mattered. Americans wanted Cherokee land, and they took it through a process that combined legal fraud, military force, and bureaucratic indifference to suffering. The Trail of Tears was not simply a tragedy, but a crime, an act of ethnic cleansing carried out by a democratic government against a people who had sought peaceful coexistence and legal resolution. It revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American democracy, that high-minded principles and constitutional guarantees applied only to those with the power to enforce their rights, and that when law conflicted with popular will, backed by state power, law would yield. The Cherokee learned this lesson in the harshest way possible, through the deaths of thousands and the loss of their homeland. Other southeastern nations suffered similar fates during the same period. The Choctaw had been removed earlier, in 1831, suffering their own Trail of Tears. The Creek were forcibly removed in 1836, the Chickasaw followed in 1837, the Seminole fought a guerrilla war in Florida but were ultimately mostly removed in the 1840s. Together these removals displaced over 60,000 indigenous people, killing thousands and dispossessing entire nations of their ancestral homelands. The Cherokee removal was the largest and best documented, but not unique, in its cruelty or injustice. A small number of Cherokee managed to avoid removal by hiding in the mountains of North Carolina, living as fugitives until the removal crisis passed. These people, numbering perhaps 1,000, maintained a Cherokee presence in the East. They would eventually gain federal recognition as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, a separate nation from those who were forced west. Their survival represented Cherokee refusal to be entirely erased from their homeland, a remnant that maintained the connection to the land where Cherokee people had lived since time beyond memory. As the last removal detachments reached Indian Territory in the spring of 1839, the survivors faced the enormous task of rebuilding their lives in an unfamiliar land. They arrived with little more than what they could carry, having lost homes, farms, businesses, and possessions that represented generations of accumulation. They were strangers in a place that would now have to become home. They were traumatized, grieving, angry, and deeply divided over who was responsible for the catastrophe that had befallen them. The Trail of Tears had ended, but its consequences had only begun to unfold. The land that the Cherokee reached after their long journey of suffering was vastly different from the mountains and valleys they had left behind. Indian Territory, the region that would later become Oklahoma, stretched across prairies and rolling hills covered in tall grass. There were forests along river valleys, but nothing like the dense woodlands of the southern Appalachians. The climate was more extreme, with hotter summers and colder winters. The soil, plants, and animals were unfamiliar. This place looked nothing like home, and for people who had just endured months of trauma and death, that strangeness added to their profound sense of loss and displacement. The Cherokee were not the first of their people to arrive in this territory. A group called the Old Settlers, also known as the Western Cherokee, had been living there since the early 1800s. These were Cherokee families who had voluntarily moved west decades earlier, seeking to escape the pressure of American expansion by relocating before removal became forced policy. They numbered perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 people and had established farms, communities, and a functioning government in the years before the removal. They considered the territory their own and had developed their own laws, leaders, and way of life. The arrival of more than 15,000 Cherokee refugees from the east created immediate tensions. The Old Settlers had established themselves as a distinct political entity with their own constitution and elected chiefs. They expected the newcomers to join their government and live under their laws. The refugees, who vastly outnumbered the Old Settlers, believed that their national government under John Ross remained legitimate and that the entire Cherokee Nation should be reunited under the Constitution adopted in 1827. These competing claims to political authority would create conflict that threatened to tear the Cherokee Nation apart. Adding to this volatile situation were the members of the Treaty Party, led by Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot. These men and their families had removed earlier, avoiding the worst of the Trail of Tears by leaving before the military roundup. They had acted as intermediaries between the Old Settlers and federal authorities, and they aligned themselves with the Old Settler government. The Treaty Party members knew they were hated by the majority of Cherokee people, blamed for signing the fraudulent treaty that had resulted in forced removal and thousands of deaths. The spring and summer of 1839 passed with increasing tension as the three factions attempted to negotiate a path toward reunification. John Ross and the National Party leadership sought to establish a unified government under the 1827 Constitution. The Old Settlers insisted on their prior claim to political authority. The Treaty Party attempted to protect themselves from the vengeance they knew many Cherokee desired. Public meetings were held where representatives from each faction argued their positions, but no agreement could be reached. The political deadlock continued while ordinary Cherokee people struggled to survive in their new homeland. On June 22, 1839, the conflict exploded into violence. In coordinated early morning attacks, approximately 100 Cherokee men carried out what they considered executions of those who had signed the Treaty of New Echota. Major Ridge was shot from his horse while riding on a road in Arkansas. His son, John Ridge, was dragged from his bed in front of his wife and children and stabbed to death. Elias Boudinot was tomahawked while helping to build a house, dying within minutes of being called outside by men he thought were friends. The killings were not random violence but deliberate enforcement of Cherokee law. The Cherokee legal code, passed years earlier, prescribed death for anyone who sold Cherokee land without proper authorization. The men who carried out the killings believed they were acting as executors of justice, punishing traitors who had caused the Trail of Tears and the deaths of thousands. They saw themselves not as murderers but as patriots, upholding Cherokee sovereignty and law. The identity of all the executioners was never definitively established, though Standwaite, Boudinot's brother and a treaty party leader, believed he knew who was responsible. Standwaite survived because he was warned and managed to escape before assassins reached him. He would spend the rest of his life as a bitter enemy of John Ross and the National Party, convinced that Ross had ordered the killings, even though no evidence ever proved Ross's involvement. Watie gathered supporters from the Treaty Party and some old settlers, creating an armed faction that threatened civil war. Cherokee country descended into chaos, with armed groups roaming the countryside, scores being settled through violence, and law enforcement breaking down entirely. The federal government, which bore ultimate responsibility for the crisis by forcing removal in the first place, proved unable or unwilling to restore order. Federal agents in Indian Territory wrote reports describing the violence and warning of potential civil war, but Washington offered little practical assistance. The Cherokee were left to resolve their internal conflicts without outside intervention, though federal authorities made clear that they would not tolerate wholesale warfare that might disrupt other settlements in the region. Cherokee leaders eventually pulled back from the brink of civil war through exhausting negotiations and pragmatic compromises. In the summer of 1839, a convention was held at which representatives from all factions attended, though with profound mutual suspicion. After weeks of debate, a compromise was reached. The Cherokee Nation would be reunited under a modified version of the 1827 Constitution. John Ross would continue as principal chief. The old settlers and treaty party would be represented in the new government. An act of union was signed declaring that the Cherokee people were once again united as a single nation. This political reconciliation did not end the violence or heal the divisions. Sporadic killings continued for years. Feuds between families erupted into gunfights. Trust between the factions remained minimal. The trauma of removal, combined with the assassinations and their aftermath, created wounds that would not heal for generations. Cherokee society remained fractured beneath the surface of political unity, with many people nursing grievances and suspicions that poisoned relationships within the nation. Despite these internal conflicts, the Cherokee began the difficult work of rebuilding. They faced enormous practical challenges. Most arrived with almost nothing, having lost their property and possessions during removal. They needed to build homes, clear land for farming, plant crops, and establish the infrastructure of daily life. The first years were desperately hard, with many families living in temporary shelters and struggling to produce enough food. Federal government promised financial compensation, and assistance often arrived late or not at all, forcing Cherokee people to rely on their own resources and resilience. The Cherokee established a new capital at Tahlequah in 1839, building government offices and creating the institutional structures of their nation. They recreated their court system, established schools, and resumed publication of the Cherokee Phoenix, which had ceased during removal. They passed laws, collected taxes, and governed themselves with the same determination they had shown in the East. The Cherokee were demonstrating yet again their capacity for self-governance and their refusal to be destroyed by the catastrophes that had been inflicted upon them. Agriculture developed slowly but successfully. Cherokee farmers adapted to the different soil and climate, learning which crops grew well and which techniques worked in prairie conditions. Corn remained the staple crop, supplemented by wheat, vegetables, and orchards. Livestock raising became increasingly important, with Cherokee ranchers developing substantial herds of cattle, horses, and hogs. The prairie grasslands proved well suited to grazing, and some Cherokee became wealthy through commercial ranching. The economy diversified beyond subsistence farming into commercial agriculture and trade. Education remained a priority despite the poverty and chaos of the early years. The Cherokee established public schools throughout the nation, funded by the national government and staffed by Cherokee teachers. Mission schools also operated, offering both elementary and advanced education. The Cherokee male and female seminaries, established in the 1850s, provided education equivalent to the best academies in the states, preparing Cherokee youth for leadership roles. Cherokee literacy rates remained high, and education was seen as essential for maintaining Cherokee culture and preparing future generations to defend Cherokee interests. The Cherokee created thriving communities in Indian Territory, building towns with stores, churches, Masonic lodges, and social organizations. They maintained their clan system, continued speaking the Cherokee language, and preserved cultural practices that connected them to their past. They adapted to their new environment while maintaining their identity as Cherokee people. The resilience they demonstrated was remarkable, transforming themselves from traumatized refugees into a stable, functioning society within a single generation. Economic development created wealth for some Cherokee, but also increased inequality within the nation. Large plantation owners with African slaves accumulated substantial property and income. Successful merchants and ranchers built fortunes through commercial enterprise. Meanwhile, many traditional Cherokee people maintained subsistence farms and lived modestly. This wealth disparity created class divisions that mirrored those that had existed in the East, but became more pronounced in the West. The mixed heritage elite who dominated politics and business often lived very differently than full-blood Cherokee who maintained more traditional lifestyles. The question of slavery continued to divide Cherokee society. Some Cherokee owned substantial numbers of enslaved people and defended slavery as vigorously as any Southern planter. The Cherokee national government passed laws protecting slavery, establishing slave patrols, and punishing those who helped enslaved people escape. Other Cherokee opposed slavery on moral grounds or viewed it as inconsistent with Cherokee values. This division over slavery would have catastrophic consequences when the United States descended into civil war in 1861. The Cherokee Nation developed economic relationships with the United States and with neighboring indigenous nations. They traded agricultural products and livestock for manufactured goods. Cherokee merchants operated stores that served both Cherokee customers and travelers passing through Cherokee territory. The nation collected taxes on these commercial activities, generating revenue that funded government operations and public services. The Cherokee economy was increasingly integrated into the broader American economic system, creating interdependence that brought both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Relations with the federal government remained complicated and often contentious. The United States had promised compensation for Cherokee property lost during removal, but payments were delayed for years and were often inadequate when they finally arrived. Disputes over treaty provisions required constant negotiation. Federal Indian agents stationed in Cherokee territory sometimes interfered in Cherokee affairs, creating friction with Cherokee authorities who insisted on their sovereignty. The relationship was theoretically between equals bound by treaties, but in practice, federal power always loomed over Cherokee autonomy. The Cherokee also negotiated relationships with other indigenous nations relocated to Indian Territory. The Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations all had territories adjacent to the Cherokee Nation. These nations, which had all suffered removal, shared common interests and often cooperated on issues affecting them all. They also had distinct identities and sometimes competing interests that created tensions. The Cherokee worked to maintain peaceful relations with their indigenous neighbors while defending Cherokee territorial boundaries and interests. Religious life in the Cherokee Nation reflected the diversity of Cherokee society. Christian churches multiplied with Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian congregations established in communities throughout the nation. Many Cherokee embraced Christianity genuinely, finding spiritual meaning in the new faith. Others attended church while maintaining traditional religious practices in private. Some Cherokee rejected Christianity entirely, continuing to observe traditional ceremonies and maintain the old ways. This religious diversity created another dimension of social division, with Christians and traditionalists sometimes viewing each other with suspicion or contempt. The Cherokee language remained vital despite increasing English literacy. Most Cherokee people spoke Cherokee as their first language, and it was the language of daily life in most Cherokee homes and communities. The syllabary invented by Sequoyah ensured that Cherokee could be written and read, giving the language a permanence that oral tradition alone could not provide. Cherokee language publications circulated widely, and bilingual education allowed children to learn both Cherokee and English. The language connected Cherokee people to their ancestors and to each other, maintaining cultural continuity across the rupture of removal. Cultural practices evolved in the new environment. Traditional dances, ceremonies, and social customs continued, adapted to prairie surroundings and new circumstances. Cherokee people created new traditions that responded to their experience of removal and resettlement. They told stories about the Trail of Tears, passed down accounts of suffering and survival that became part of Cherokee collective memory. They honored those who had died and celebrated those who had persevered. They created a culture that acknowledged trauma while affirming survival and resilience. By the late 1850s, the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory had achieved a level of stability and prosperity that seemed almost miraculous given the catastrophe of 2 decades earlier. The population was growing through natural increase, the economy was developing successfully, the government was functioning effectively, schools were educating children, communities were thriving. The Cherokee had survived removal and were rebuilding their nation with determination and skill. They had created a new home in an unfamiliar land, proving once again their capacity to adapt and endure. This hard-won stability was about to be destroyed by forces beyond Cherokee control. The United States was moving toward civil war over slavery, and the Cherokee Nation would be drawn into that conflict with devastating results. The divisions within Cherokee society over slavery and political allegiance would explode into violence that would once again bring death and destruction to the Cherokee people. The peace and prosperity of the late 1850s would prove fleeting, a brief interlude between the trauma of removal and the catastrophe of civil war that was approaching on the horizon. The sectional crisis that tore the United States apart in 1861 placed the Cherokee Nation in an impossible situation. The Cherokee had no interest in American conflicts over slavery, no desire to participate in a war between the states, and every reason to maintain neutrality. They had seen what happened when indigenous nations became involved in conflicts between American factions. The Revolutionary War had devastated Cherokee communities, and they had learned that taking sides in American wars brought nothing but suffering. Principal Chief John Ross initially advocated for neutrality, arguing that the Cherokee should wait to see how the conflict developed before committing to either side. Neutrality proved impossible to maintain for several compelling reasons. The Cherokee Nation was surrounded by slaveholding states and territories, with Arkansas to the east, Texas to the south, and Kansas to the north. When these states began seceding from the Union and joining the Confederacy, the Cherokee found themselves geographically isolated in Confederate territory with no access to federal authorities or protection. Confederate agents immediately began pressuring the Cherokee to ally with the South, offering treaties, trade agreements, and promises of respect for Cherokee sovereignty. The Confederacy had strong advocates within the Cherokee Nation. Stand Watie, who had survived the 1839 assassinations and remained a bitter enemy of John Ross, immediately declared his support for the Confederate cause. Watie and his followers, drawn largely from the old Treaty Party and wealthy slaveholding Cherokee, believed that Cherokee interests aligned with the Confederacy. They owned slaves, shared economic interests with Southern planters, and distrusted the federal government that had forced Cherokee removal. They saw the Confederacy as a new nation that might respect Cherokee sovereignty more than the United States had. The collapse of federal authority in Indian Territory further undermined Cherokee neutrality. Federal troops abandoned their posts and withdrew, leaving the Cherokee without the treaty-guaranteed protection that the United States had promised. Federal annuity payments stopped arriving, cutting off revenue, that the Cherokee government depended upon, federal Indian agents fled, severing official communication with Washington. The Cherokee were left alone, surrounded by Confederate states and forces, with no practical way to maintain ties to the Union, even if they wanted to. Under these pressures, the Cherokee National Council voted in August 1861 to ally with the Confederacy. John Ross signed a treaty with Confederate Commissioner Albert Pike, pledging Cherokee support for the Confederate cause in exchange for promises of protection, continued annuity payments, and representation in the Confederate Congress. Ross later claimed he signed under duress, that he had no real choice given the circumstances, and that he had acted to preserve Cherokee interests in an impossible situation. His critics, then and later, accused him of abandoning his principles for expediency. The treaty with the Confederacy immediately split the Cherokee Nation along familiar fault lines. Stand Watie was commissioned as a colonel in the Confederate Army and began raising a Cherokee regiment. Many of his recruits came from the old Treaty Party families who had supported removal, creating a direct continuation of the factional divisions from the 1830s. Watie's supporters saw the Civil War as an opportunity to finally settle old scores with Ross and the National Party, this time with Confederate backing. Not all Cherokees supported the Confederate alliance. Many, particularly full-blood Cherokee and those from more traditional communities, opposed both slavery and the Confederacy. They remained loyal to John Ross but questioned his decision to ally with the South. Some of these Cherokee maintained secret Union sympathies, believing that the United States, despite all its failures and betrayals, remained their legitimate treaty partner. This division meant that Cherokee communities were fractured from the beginning of the war, with neighbors and sometimes family members on opposite sides. The war came to Cherokee country quickly and brutally. In 1861, Cherokee troops under Confederate command participated in the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas, fighting alongside Texas and Arkansas units against Union forces. The battle was a Confederate defeat, and Cherokee troops performed poorly, many fleeing when the battle turned against the South. The defeat at Pea Ridge demonstrated that Cherokee soldiers, whatever their courage, were not prepared for the scale and intensity of Civil War combat. Union forces invaded Indian Territory in the summer of 1862, forcing John Ross to flee north. He was captured by Union troops, though he was treated as a guest rather than a prisoner. Ross went to Washington, where he repudiated the Confederate treaty and declared his personal loyalty to the Union. He claimed that he had never truly supported the Confederacy, that he had signed the treaty only because he had no choice, and that his heart had always remained with the United States. Whether this was true or merely politically convenient remains debated, but Ross's defection to the Union side formalized the split within the Cherokee Nation. With Ross in Union territory, Stand Watie emerged as the leader of Confederate Cherokee. Watie was promoted to Brigadier General, the only indigenous person to achieve that rank in the Confederate Army. He was a skilled guerrilla fighter, leading Cherokee cavalry units in raids throughout Indian Territory, Kansas, and Arkansas. Watie's forces attacked Union supply lines, ambushed Federal troops, and targeted Cherokee communities that supported the Union. He was a resourceful and determined commander who made his forces a genuine threat despite limited resources and manpower. The Cherokee Nation descended into vicious civil war within the larger Civil War. Pro-Union Cherokee, organized as the Cherokee National Home Guard under John Ross's authority, fought against Confederate Cherokee under Stand Watie. Communities were raided and burned by both sides. Livestock was stolen, crops destroyed, and civilians killed regardless of their actual political allegiances. The violence was personal and vindictive, settling grievances that dated back to the removal era while generating new hatreds that would persist for generations. The fighting devastated Cherokee country. Farms were abandoned as families fled advancing armies or raiding parties. Fields went unplanted or were destroyed before harvest. Schools closed and churches were burned. The infrastructure that the Cherokee had worked so hard to build after removal was systematically destroyed by 4 years of continuous warfare. The Cherokee Nation became a battleground where armies from both sides fought, and Cherokee people suffered regardless of which side they supported or whether they tried to remain neutral. Refugees streamed out of Cherokee territory in all directions. Pro-Union Cherokee fled north into Kansas, where they lived in camps under miserable conditions, dependent on federal rations that were often inadequate and late in arriving. Thousands died in these refugee camps from disease, exposure, and starvation. Confederate Cherokees sought shelter in Texas and Arkansas when Union forces controlled Cherokee territory. Civilians trying to avoid the fighting fled into remote areas, hiding in forests and surviving as best they could. The Cherokee population was scattered, traumatized, and dying in numbers that recalled the Trail of Tears. Stand Watie fought on after most of the Confederacy had collapsed. He led his Cherokee cavalry in raids well into 1865, even after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Watie's last significant action was the capture of a Union steamboat on the Arkansas River in June 1865, taking supplies and prisoners. He finally surrendered on June 23, 1865, the last Confederate general to lay down arms. Watie's determined resistance made him a hero to some Cherokee and a villain to others, but everyone acknowledged his skill and tenacity as a military leader. The Civil War killed thousands of Cherokee people. Exact numbers are impossible to determine, but estimates suggest that the Cherokee Nation lost at least 1/4 of its population during the war years, whether through combat deaths, disease, starvation, or flight to other regions. The demographic catastrophe rivaled the Trail of Tears in its devastation. The Cherokee Nation that survived the war was a shell of what had existed in 1860, reduced in population, impoverished, and bitterly divided. The physical destruction was staggering. The Cherokee capital at Tahlequah was occupied by troops from both sides at various times and suffered significant damage. The Cherokee male and female seminaries, pride of the Cherokee educational system, were used as military hospitals and suffered damage that would take years to repair. Homes, barns, mills, and businesses were burned. Livestock herds were depleted by military requisitions and theft. The Cherokee Nation's infrastructure was destroyed as thoroughly as if an invading army had deliberately targeted it for annihilation. The end of the Civil War brought no peace to the Cherokee Nation. The federal government, which had promised protection and then abandoned the Cherokee to civil war, now demanded punishment for Cherokee participation in the rebellion. Federal officials conveniently forgot that the United States had withdrawn protection and left the Cherokee no viable option but alliance with the Confederacy. Instead, they treated the Cherokee as traitors who must pay for their rebellion, imposing harsh treaty conditions that would reshape the Cherokee Nation fundamentally. The Treaty of 1866, negotiated between the Cherokee Nation and the United States after the war, was punitive and exploitative. The treaty required the Cherokee to abolish slavery and grant citizenship to freed people who had been enslaved in the Cherokee Nation. This was the one progressive provision in an otherwise destructive document. The treaty also required the Cherokee to cede the entire western half of their territory, roughly 800,000 acres, which would be sold to other indigenous nations or open to white settlement. The Cherokee received minimal compensation for this massive land cession. The treaty imposed a requirement that the Cherokee allow railroads to be built through their territory, with routes and terms to be determined later without Cherokee consent. This provision would prove disastrous, opening Cherokee land to thousands of railroad workers, settlers, and opportunists who would overwhelm Cherokee institutions and eventually destroy Cherokee sovereignty. The treaty also reduced Cherokee annuities, cut federal support for schools, and imposed other financial penalties. It was a victor's peace imposed on a defeated people, without regard for justice or Cherokee suffering during the war. John Ross did not live to see the full consequences of the 1866 treaty. He died in Washington in August 1866, while still negotiating treaty terms, ending a life dedicated to Cherokee survival and sovereignty. Ross had led the Cherokee through removal, had overseen the rebuilding in Indian Territory, and had tried to navigate the impossible choices of the Civil War era. He died knowing that his people had survived, but uncertain whether they could endure what was coming. His death marked the end of an era, the passing of a generation that had known the Cherokee homeland in the East and had led the nation through its darkest hours. Stand Watie survived the war and lived until 1871, remaining unreconciled with the National Party that had dominated Cherokee politics under Ross. The divisions between former Confederate and Union Cherokee persisted after the war, poisoning politics and community relations. Some Cherokee never forgave Watie for fighting against his own people, viewing him as a traitor who had put his personal grievances above Cherokee unity. Others celebrated him as a hero who had fought bravely for the cause he believed in. These competing memories ensured that Civil War divisions would not heal quickly. The Cherokee Nation that emerged from the Civil War bore little resemblance to the prosperous society of the late 1850s. The population had been decimated, the economy destroyed, and the territory cut in half. The people were traumatized, impoverished, and divided against each other. They faced a future in which railroads would bring floods of non-Cherokee settlers, in which federal power would be exercised more aggressively than ever before, and in which Cherokee sovereignty would be under constant assault. The Cherokee had survived removal and had rebuilt their nation, only to see it destroyed again by a war that was not of their making. Yet even in devastation, the Cherokee began rebuilding again. They re-established their government, reopened schools, and rebuilt their farms and businesses. They demonstrated the same resilience that had carried them through removal and the Trail of Tears. Cherokee people refused to disappear, refused to give up, and refused to let the catastrophes that had been inflicted upon them destroy their identity or their determination to survive as a people. They had been broken but not destroyed, and they would rise again from the ashes of war to rebuild their nation once more. The price of this rebuilding would be high, and the challenges ahead were immense. The Cherokee Nation would face pressures greater than anything they had experienced before. Railroads bringing masses of settlers, allotment policies designed to destroy communal land ownership, and a federal government determined to eliminate tribal sovereignty and force assimilation. The Cherokee would fight these threats with every resource they possessed, but the outcome was never certain. The next chapters of Cherokee history would be as challenging as those that had come before, testing Cherokee resilience to its absolute limits. The decades following the Civil War brought new forms of assault on Cherokee sovereignty, more insidious and ultimately more destructive than military force. The railroads came first, cutting through Cherokee territory and bringing with them thousands of workers, merchants, opportunists, and settlers. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, known as the Katy, was completed through Cherokee country in 1872. Other rail lines followed, creating a network that made Cherokee territory easily accessible from all directions. Towns sprang up along these rail lines, populated primarily by non-Cherokee residents who owed no allegiance to Cherokee law and who increasingly demanded that the United States extend its jurisdiction over them. These railroad towns created zones of lawlessness where Cherokee authority was ignored and federal authority was distant and ineffective. Saloons, gambling houses, and brothels flourished, attracting criminals who found refuge in jurisdictional confusion. The Cherokee Nation lacked the resources to police these towns effectively, while federal marshals were too few and often corrupt. The result was chaos that undermined Cherokee governance and created the impression that the Cherokee Nation could not maintain order, providing ammunition for those who argued that tribal government should be abolished. Non-Cherokee settlers arrived in staggering numbers as the railroad made travel easy, and as rumors of opportunity in Indian territory spread. These intruders, called squatters by the Cherokee, established farms and businesses on Cherokee land without permission or legal right. They argued that Cherokee land was going unused, that the Cherokee held more territory than they needed, and that American citizens should be allowed to settle and develop it. The Cherokee government ordered squatters to leave, but lacked the enforcement power to remove thousands of illegal settlers, especially when those settlers had political allies demanding that Indian territory be opened to white settlement. The railroad companies themselves became powerful political actors working against Cherokee interests. They had been granted rights of way through Cherokee territory by the 1866 treaty, but they wanted more. Railroad corporations sought ownership of land along their routes for development and sale. They lobbied Congress to extinguish Indian land titles and open the territory to homesteading. The railroads had money, political connections, and public support from Americans who saw Indian territory as a valuable frontier being wasted by indigenous peoples too backward or too lazy to develop it properly. Federal Indian policy during this period was explicitly aimed at destroying tribal sovereignty and forcing indigenous peoples to assimilate into American society as individual citizens rather than members of sovereign nations. This policy, sometimes called allotment and assimilation, was promoted by reformers who genuinely believed they were helping indigenous peoples by destroying their communal societies and traditional cultures. These reformers, organized in groups like the Indian Rights Association, argued that communal land ownership kept indigenous peoples in poverty and ignorance, and that only through individual property ownership could they become civilized and prosperous. The Cherokee strongly opposed allotment, understanding that dividing communal tribal land into individual parcels would lead inevitably to land loss and the destruction of tribal government. Cherokee leaders pointed out that they already had a successful economic system, functioning schools, and effective governance. They argued that allotment was designed not to help them but to take their land by converting surplus territory into public domain available for white settlement. Their opposition was articulate and well-reasoned, but it ran against the tide of American opinion and policy. Congress passed the Dawes Act in 1887, authorizing the allotment of reservation land on most reservations throughout the United States. The act initially exempted the 5 civilized tribes, including the Cherokee, in recognition of their sophisticated governments and successful adaptation to American civilization. This exemption proved temporary. Pressure from settlers, railroads, and reformers demanding that Indian territory be opened continued to build. Politicians representing Western states and territories wanted the land for their constituents. Reform groups insisted that allotment would help the Cherokee by forcing them to abandon their backward communal ways. The Cherokee Nation mounted a determined defense against allotment throughout the 1880s and 1890s. Cherokee delegates traveled to Washington repeatedly, presenting memorials to Congress that explained why allotment would harm their people. They hired lawyers to challenge legislation and defend Cherokee treaty rights. They cultivated relationships with sympathetic congressmen and tried to mobilize public opinion in their favor. Chief Dennis Bushyhead, who served in the 1880s, and his successors fought a continuous political battle to preserve Cherokee sovereignty and communal land ownership. The Cherokee experienced a cultural renaissance during these same years despite the external threats to their existence. The Cherokee male and female seminaries, rebuilt after Civil War damage, provided excellent education to hundreds of students. These schools maintained high academic standards with curricula comparable to the best academies in the states. Cherokee students studied literature, mathematics, science, and classical languages. The seminaries produced graduates who became teachers, lawyers, doctors, and business leaders, demonstrating Cherokee intellectual achievement and contributing to the development of a well-educated leadership class. Cherokee publications flourished during this period. The Cherokee Advocate newspaper resumed publication after the war, serving as the voice of the Cherokee national government and a forum for political debate. Other newspapers in Cherokee and English circulated throughout the nation. Cherokee authors wrote poetry, fiction, and historical accounts. The syllabary remained in widespread use, ensuring that Cherokee language literacy continued even as English became more common in schools and government. Cherokee cultural life was vibrant and creative, producing art, music, and literature that enriched Cherokee society. Traditional Cherokee practices coexisted with modern institutions in complex ways. Many Cherokee maintained traditional religious beliefs and practices alongside or instead of Christianity. The stomp dance, a communal dance with deep spiritual significance, continued in many communities. Traditional healers still treated illness using plant medicines and spiritual rituals. The clan system, though weakened by the adoption of American legal structures, retained social significance. Full-blood Cherokee communities, particularly in more remote areas, maintained lifestyles that blended traditional practices with modern elements. The wealth disparity within Cherokee society continued to grow during this period. A small elite, largely mixed heritage and English-speaking, controlled significant property and dominated politics. These individuals often lived in substantial homes, sent their children to the best schools, and traveled to eastern cities for business and pleasure. They were culturally Cherokee but lived lives that were economically and socially indistinguishable from wealthy Americans. At the other end of the spectrum, many full-blood Cherokee lived modestly, farming small plots and maintaining more traditional lifestyles. This class division created social tensions and political conflicts within the nation. Political factions emerged that reflected these social and cultural divisions, though they were not simply splits between mixed heritage and full-blood Cherokee. The National Party system involved competing groups with different visions for Cherokee future and different strategies for dealing with American pressure. Elections were often contentious, with accusations of fraud and corruption. Political violence occasionally erupted, echoing the factional conflicts that had plagued the Cherokee Nation since removal. Despite these problems, the Cherokee maintained a functioning democratic government that was far more accountable to its citizens than many American state governments of the era. The federal government created the Dawes Commission in 1893 with the specific mission of negotiating allotment agreements with the 5 civilized tribes. The commission, named for its chairman Henry Dawes, was instructed to pressure the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations into accepting allotment whether they wanted it or not. The commission established offices in Indian Territory and began negotiations, meeting with tribal leaders and attempting to convince or coerce them into accepting allotment. When negotiation failed, the commission simply assumed the authority to begin enrolling tribal members for allotment without tribal consent. Cherokee resistance to the Dawes Commission was fierce but ultimately futile. Cherokee leaders refused to negotiate, denied the commission's authority, and continued to assert Cherokee sovereignty. The commission responded by enrolling Cherokee citizens unilaterally, creating a roll of people who would receive allotments when the inevitable division of Cherokee land occurred. The process was chaotic and corrupt, with commission employees making arbitrary decisions about who was Cherokee and who was not, creating opportunities for fraud that resulted in many non-Cherokee receiving allotments, while legitimate Cherokee was sometimes excluded. Congress passed the Curtis Act in 1898, unilaterally abolishing tribal courts and extending federal jurisdiction over Indian Territory. The act was a naked assertion of federal power, ignoring Cherokee sovereignty and treaty rights entirely. It declared that tribal governments would be dissolved, that tribal lands would be allotted, and that Indian Territory would be incorporated into a new state. The Curtis Act represented the culmination of decades of pressure to destroy tribal sovereignty and open Indian Territory to white settlement. For the Cherokee, it was the legal death sentence for their government and their nation. The Cherokee Nation fought the Curtis Act in court, arguing that it violated treaties that guaranteed Cherokee self-governance. Federal courts rejected these arguments, holding that Congress had plenary power over indigenous peoples and could unilaterally abrogate treaties. The Supreme Court declined to protect Cherokee treaty rights, effectively ruling that indigenous nations existed at the sufferance of Congress and had no constitutional protection against congressional action. This judicial abandonment of treaty obligations paralleled the Supreme Court's earlier willingness to let Georgia violate Cherokee rights with impunity. Once again, the law provided no protection when Cherokee rights conflicted with American expansionist desires. Allotment proceeded through the early 1900s despite continued Cherokee opposition. Each Cherokee citizen was assigned an individual allotment, typically 110 acres for adults. The Cherokee Nation had contained nearly 5 million acres before allotment. After every Cherokee citizen received their allotment, millions of acres remained as surplus land. This surplus was sold by the federal government to non-Cherokee settlers, generating revenue that went to the United States while dispossessing the Cherokee of land they had held communally. The allotment process was exactly what Cherokee leaders had predicted, a mechanism for taking Cherokee land under the pretense of helping Cherokee people. Many Cherokee lost their allotments within a few years through fraud, tax sales, or simple inability to pay property taxes on land they had received without the capital to develop it. Land speculators targeted Cherokee allottees using deception, intimidation, and legal manipulation to acquire allotments at a fraction of their value. The restrictions on alienation of allotted land, intended to protect allottees from losing their property, were systematically evaded or removed through congressional action. Within a generation, much of the allotted land had passed out of Cherokee ownership, replaced by non-Cherokee farmers and ranchers who had acquired it through purchase or foreclosure. The Cherokee government struggled to maintain its functions as its legal authority was stripped away and its territory was divided. The principal chief continued to be elected and National Council continued to meet, but their power was increasingly symbolic. They could not enforce laws against the thousands of non-Cherokee residents now living on former Cherokee land. They could not prevent allottees from selling their land or stop speculators from defrauding Cherokee citizens. They watched helplessly as the nation they had fought so hard to preserve was dismantled by federal fiat. Oklahoma statehood in 1907 marked the formal end of Cherokee sovereignty in its historical form. When Oklahoma became a state, incorporating both Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory, the Cherokee Nation ceased to exist as a functioning government. The principal chief's office was abolished by federal order. The National Council stopped meeting. Cherokee courts closed permanently. Cherokee laws were superseded by state law. The Cherokee who had governed themselves for centuries, who had adapted to every change demanded of them, who had rebuilt their nation twice after catastrophic destruction, now found themselves citizens of a state whose government they had not created and whose laws they had not made. The Cherokee population was now a minority in their own territory, outnumbered by non-Cherokee settlers who had flooded into what had been Cherokee land. The town of Tahlequah, once the capital of the Cherokee Nation, was now just another Oklahoma town with a majority white population. Cherokee citizens were scattered across northeastern Oklahoma on individual allotments, no longer living in cohesive communities governed by Cherokee law. The physical geography of Cherokee existence had been fundamentally altered, with the communal nation replaced by dispersed individuals subject to state and federal authority. The federal government appointed a principal chief after statehood, selecting individuals to serve in a purely administrative capacity to handle the ongoing business of dissolving Cherokee national assets. These appointed chiefs had no political power and represented no one but the federal government that appointed them. This was a mockery of Cherokee self-governance, with the title of principal chief reduced to that of a federal employee managing the liquidation of Cherokee national property. The once powerful office of principal chief, which had been held by giants like John Ross, was reduced to a clerkship. Cherokee people did not disappear despite the destruction of their government and the dispossession of their land. They continued to identify as Cherokee, to speak the Cherokee language, to maintain cultural practices, and to remember their history. Cherokee families kept the syllabary alive, teaching it to children who learned to read and write Cherokee, even as Oklahoma schools taught only in English. Cherokee churches held services in Cherokee language. Traditional stomp grounds continued to hold dances. The Cherokee survived as a people even without a government to represent them or land held in common. The early decades of the 20th century were dark times for the Cherokee. They were poor, often living on marginal land that had not been taken from them because no one else wanted it. They suffered from inadequate health care, poor education, and limited economic opportunities. They were subjected to discrimination by white Oklahomans who viewed them as inferior and primitive. They had no political power, no legal recognition as a nation, and no means to protect their remaining land or resources. The Cherokee had been reduced from a sovereign nation to a dispossessed minority within an American state. Yet through all of this, Cherokee people maintained their identity and their determination to survive. They told their children the stories of the Trail of Tears, of the Civil War, of the great chiefs who had fought to preserve the nation. They taught the language, practiced the ceremonies, and maintained the connections that made them Cherokee. They had lost their government and most of their land, but they had not lost themselves. They endured through what seemed like the final destruction of Cherokee nationhood, carrying forward the culture and identity that had survived everything that had been done to them. They waited for better times, for a chance to rebuild once more, believing that the Cherokee people would endure, and that somehow, someday, the Cherokee Nation would rise again. The Cherokee people lived through the first half of the 20th century without a functioning government, dispersed across northeastern Oklahoma, and surviving as individuals rather than as a unified nation. Federal policy during this era remained focused on assimilation, attempting to erase indigenous identities and force indigenous peoples to abandon their cultures and languages. Cherokee children were sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak Cherokee and were punished for practicing traditional customs. The goal was explicit: to kill the Indian and save the man, to destroy Cherokee culture within a single generation and replace it with American civilization. These boarding schools traumatized generations of Cherokee children. Students were forcibly removed from their families and sent to institutions where they were stripped of their clothing, their hair was cut, and they were given American names. They were taught that everything Cherokee was backward and shameful, that their parents were ignorant savages, and that salvation lay in rejecting their heritage and embracing American ways. The physical and emotional abuse was often severe, with children beaten for speaking their own language or maintaining connections to their culture. Many children died in these schools from disease, neglect, or abuse, buried far from home in unmarked graves. The psychological damage from boarding schools affected Cherokee communities for generations. Children returned to their families unable to speak Cherokee, alienated from traditional culture, and ashamed of their identity. Parents who had sent children away in hope of giving them educational opportunities found themselves unable to communicate with their own offspring. The intergenerational transmission of language and culture was disrupted, creating gaps in cultural knowledge that would prove difficult to repair. The trauma of separation and abuse created lasting wounds that affected not only individuals but entire communities. Despite these assaults on Cherokee identity, the language and culture survived in households and communities where parents and grandparents refused to let them die. Elders continued teaching children the syllabary, maintaining the literacy that Sequoyah had created. Traditional healers continued using plant medicines and spiritual practices. Stomp grounds remained active, hosting ceremonial dances that connected participants to ancestors and to Cherokee spiritual traditions. The clan system continued to have social meaning even without legal recognition. These acts of cultural preservation were forms of resistance, quiet defiance of federal policies aimed at Cherokee extinction as a distinct people. Cherokee people navigated American society with resilience and adaptability. They served in the military during World Wars I and II, demonstrating patriotism and courage while defending a country that had repeatedly betrayed them. Cherokee soldiers fought in Europe and the Pacific, earning medals and recognition for their service. They returned home to Oklahoma still facing discrimination and poverty, still denied many of the rights they had fought to protect. Yet their military service demonstrated Cherokee commitment to America, even as America continued to deny Cherokee sovereignty and rights. The economic situation for most Cherokee people remained difficult throughout the early 20th century. Many lived in rural poverty, farming marginal land or working low-wage jobs. The Great Depression hit Cherokee communities particularly hard, as people who were already poor found themselves facing starvation and homelessness. New Deal programs provided some assistance, but were often administered in ways that discriminated against Indigenous peoples. Cherokee people survived through mutual support, sharing resources within extended families and communities, relying on traditional subsistence practices like hunting, fishing, and gathering to supplement inadequate incomes. A small number of Cherokee achieved economic success and professional prominence during this period. Cherokee doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business owners demonstrated that Cherokee people could succeed by American standards while maintaining their Cherokee identity. These successful individuals often became informal leaders within Cherokee communities, using their education and resources to help others. They preserved connections to Cherokee culture while navigating American society, modeling a bicultural identity that combined Cherokee heritage with American citizenship. The Cherokee Foundation was formed in the 1940s by Cherokee citizens concerned about cultural preservation and community welfare. Operating without government support or official status, the foundation worked to preserve Cherokee language and history, to provide assistance to Cherokee families in need, and to maintain connections among Cherokee people scattered across Oklahoma and beyond. Such grassroots organizations kept Cherokee identity alive during decades when the nation had no official existence and when federal policy actively sought Cherokee cultural destruction. The political landscape for Indigenous peoples began to shift in the 1960s and 1970s as the civil rights movement drew attention to injustices faced by all minority groups in America. Indigenous activists, inspired by African American civil rights struggles, began demanding recognition of treaty rights, restoration of tribal sovereignty, and an end to termination policies that sought to abolish tribal governments. The American Indian movement and other activist organizations brought Indigenous issues to national attention through protests, occupations, and legal challenges that forced Americans to confront their government's treatment of Indigenous peoples. Federal Indian policy changed dramatically during this period. The termination era, which had sought to abolish tribal governments and end federal responsibility for Indigenous peoples, was repudiated as a catastrophic failure. New policies emphasizing self-determination and tribal sovereignty replaced the old assimilationist approach. The Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 gave tribal governments greater control over federal programs and services. This shift in policy created opportunities for tribes to rebuild governments that had been destroyed or suppressed for generations. The Cherokee Nation seized this opportunity to reconstitute its government. In 1970, Congress passed legislation allowing the Cherokee to elect their own principal chief rather than having one appointed by the federal government. This was a crucial step toward restored sovereignty, returning political power to Cherokee citizens. The first election under this new system was held in 1971, with W. W. Keeler elected as principal chief. Keeler had been serving as the federally appointed chief and was a controversial figure, but his election marked the beginning of Cherokee self-governance after more than 6 decades of federal control. Chief Ross Swimmer, elected in 1975, led a concerted effort to rebuild Cherokee government institutions. Under his leadership, the Cherokee Nation drafted a new constitution that was ratified by Cherokee voters in 1976. This constitution established a three-branch government with an elected principal chief, a legislative council, and a judicial system. It defined Cherokee citizenship, outlined governmental powers and procedures, and asserted Cherokee sovereignty. The 1976 Constitution provided the legal foundation for rebuilding the Cherokee Nation as a functioning government with the authority to serve its citizens. The Cherokee Nation began providing services to its citizens that had not been available for decades. Health clinics were established, offering medical and dental care in Cherokee communities. Educational programs were created to help Cherokee students succeed in school and to preserve Cherokee language and culture. Housing assistance helped Cherokee families obtain decent homes. Social services provided support for elders, children, and families in need. The Cherokee government was once again serving its people, fulfilling the basic functions of any government by promoting the welfare of its citizens. Economic development became a priority as the Cherokee Nation sought to create jobs and generate revenue to fund government services. The Cherokee Nation established businesses ranging from construction companies to manufacturing plants. These enterprises provided employment for Cherokee citizens and non-Cherokee residents of northeastern Oklahoma, contributing to the regional economy while generating income for the tribal government. Economic self-sufficiency was seen as essential to true sovereignty, enabling the Cherokee Nation to fund its own programs rather than depending entirely on federal appropriations. The passage of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act in 1988 transformed the economic prospects of many tribal governments, including the Cherokee Nation. This federal law authorized tribes to operate casinos and other gaming facilities on tribal land, creating opportunities for revenue generation that had not previously existed. The Cherokee Nation opened its first casino in 1994, followed by several others across northeastern Oklahoma. Gaming revenue provided unprecedented resources for tribal government operations, social services, and economic development initiatives. Casino gaming proved controversial both within and outside the Cherokee Nation. Some Cherokee people opposed gambling on moral grounds, viewing it as inconsistent with Cherokee values. Others worried about social costs associated with gambling addiction and the cultural changes that gaming wealth might bring. Non-Cherokee Oklahomans sometimes resented tribal gaming operations, seeing them as unfair competition or questioning why tribes should have economic advantages that other businesses did not enjoy. Despite these controversies, gaming revenue enabled the Cherokee Nation to build a strong economic foundation that supported a dramatic expansion of government services. The Cherokee Nation used gaming revenue to invest heavily in healthcare, education, and community development. The Cherokee Nation health services system grew to include hospitals, clinics, and wellness centers, providing comprehensive healthcare to Cherokee citizens and other eligible Indigenous people throughout northeastern Oklahoma. These facilities offered modern medical care while incorporating traditional Cherokee healing practices, blending contemporary medicine with cultural approaches to health and wellness. The health system became one of the largest employers in the region, demonstrating Cherokee capacity for operating sophisticated institutions. Language revitalization became a major priority as the Cherokee Nation confronted the reality that the Cherokee language was dying. The number of fluent speakers had declined dramatically during the 20th century, with most fluent speakers now elderly. If current trends continued, Cherokee would become extinct within a generation or two, taking with it an irreplaceable part of Cherokee identity and culture. The Cherokee Nation committed significant resources to language preservation, creating immersion schools, adult language classes, and documentation projects to record fluent speakers before they passed away. The Cherokee Immersion School, established in 2001, provides education entirely in Cherokee language from preschool through early elementary grades. Students learn to speak, read, and write Cherokee before they begin formal English instruction. The program has produced young Cherokee speakers who are fluent in their ancestral language, breaking the pattern of language loss and creating hope that Cherokee will survive as a living language. The Immersion School represents one of the most successful Indigenous language revitalization efforts in North America. Technology has been employed in Cherokee language preservation in innovative ways. The Cherokee Nation developed a Cherokee language version of Apple's iPhone interface, making modern technology accessible in Cherokee. Cherokee language learning apps and online resources make language study available to Cherokee people regardless of where they live. Social media platforms host Cherokee language content, creating digital spaces where the language is used and celebrated. These technological initiatives demonstrate Cherokee adaptability and determination to ensure that Cherokee language thrives in the contemporary world. The Cherokee Nation has also worked to preserve historical and cultural knowledge through museums, archives, and cultural centers. The Cherokee Heritage Center in Tahlequah houses extensive collections of Cherokee artifacts, documents, and artworks. Living history exhibits recreate Cherokee life in different historical periods, educating visitors about Cherokee culture and history. The Cherokee National Archives preserves documents and records essential for understanding Cherokee past and for protecting Cherokee rights. These institutions ensure that Cherokee history is told by Cherokee people rather than being defined solely by outsider perspectives. Contemporary Cherokee identity is complex and multifaceted, encompassing people with varying degrees of Cherokee ancestry, different levels of cultural knowledge, and diverse perspectives on what it means to be Cherokee. The Cherokee Nation has one of the largest tribal enrollments in the United States, with over 400,000 citizens. These citizens live throughout America and the world, not just in Oklahoma. Many have limited knowledge of Cherokee language or culture, raised far from Cherokee communities with little exposure to Cherokee traditions. Others are deeply engaged with Cherokee culture, speaking the language and participating actively in community life. Questions about Cherokee identity and citizenship have generated significant controversy. The Cherokee Nation bases citizenship on descent from people listed on the Dawes rolls created during the allotment era, requiring applicants to prove lineal descent from a person on these rolls. This definition includes people with minimal Cherokee ancestry who can document the required descent, while excluding people who may have significant Cherokee heritage but cannot prove the genealogical connection through the rolls. Some argue that the citizenship criteria are too broad, admitting people with little Cherokee ancestry or cultural connection. Others defend the current system as honoring historical Cherokee practices of inclusion based on clan membership rather than blood quantum. The Cherokee Nation has faced legal challenges regarding its treatment of the descendants of Cherokee freedmen, the formerly enslaved people who were granted Cherokee citizenship by the 1860X Treaty. In 2007, Cherokee voters approved a constitutional amendment removing freedmen descendants from citizenship unless they could prove Cherokee blood ancestry. This decision was controversial, with critics arguing it was racist and violated the 1866 treaty. Federal courts intervened, and after years of legal battles, the Cherokee Nation ultimately agreed to honor freedmen's citizenship rights. The controversy revealed ongoing tensions about race, identity, and who belongs to the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation today is one of the largest employers in Oklahoma, with thousands of employees working in government offices, healthcare facilities, casinos, and tribal enterprises. The annual economic impact of Cherokee Nation operations is measured in billions of dollars, benefiting not just Cherokee citizens, but the entire regional economy. The Cherokee Nation provides healthcare to hundreds of thousands of patients, educates thousands of students, and offers social services to countless families. It operates as a modern government with sophisticated institutions comparable to any American state or county government. Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr., elected in 2019 and re-elected in 2023, represents a new generation of Cherokee leadership. He is fluent in Cherokee, deeply committed to language and cultural preservation, and focused on expanding services to Cherokee citizens. Under his leadership, the Cherokee Nation has continued to grow economically, while increasing investment in language revitalization, healthcare, education, and cultural programs. His administration represents the realization of what Cherokee people fought for during removal and after: self-governance, cultural preservation, and the right to determine their own future. The Cherokee Nation has established relationships with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina and the United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma, the other two federally recognized Cherokee governments. While each nation is sovereign and independent, they cooperate on issues of common concern and recognize their shared heritage. The existence of multiple Cherokee nations reflects the historical divisions within the Cherokee people, but also demonstrates the resilience and adaptability that has allowed Cherokee people to survive as distinct nations across vast geographic and cultural distances. The story of the Cherokee people is one of survival against overwhelming odds. They survived disease that killed thousands. They survived military conquest and forced removal that killed thousands more. They survived civil war, allotment, and decades of federal policies designed to destroy their culture and erase their identity. They survived poverty, discrimination, and dispossession. Through all of this, they maintained their sense of themselves as Cherokee people, preserving language, culture, and community connections that defined their identity. The Cherokee Nation today stands as a testament to the resilience and determination of the Cherokee people. It is a thriving modern government that honors its past while embracing the future. It preserves Cherokee language and culture while operating casinos and hospitals. It maintains traditions that are centuries old while employing cutting-edge technology. It is thoroughly Cherokee and thoroughly contemporary, a living demonstration that Indigenous peoples can maintain their distinct identities while participating fully in the modern world. The challenges facing the Cherokee Nation remain significant. Language preservation requires continuous effort and resources. Economic development must balance revenue generation with cultural and environmental values. Healthcare needs continue to exceed available resources. The opioid epidemic has hit Cherokee communities hard, requiring comprehensive responses. Climate change threatens the environment that sustained Cherokee people for millennia. The Cherokee Nation must navigate complex relationships with federal and state governments that sometimes respect tribal sovereignty and sometimes seek to undermine it. Yet the Cherokee people face these challenges from a position of strength that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of the 20th century. They have a functioning government with substantial resources. They have institutions that preserve and promote Cherokee culture. They have young people learning the Cherokee language and embracing Cherokee identity. They have legal recognition and political power. They have survived everything that has been done to them and have rebuilt their nation twice from utter destruction. The Cherokee people endure, and the Cherokee Nation continues, carrying forward a heritage that stretches back to the time before memory into a future that remains to be written by Cherokee people themselves.